Millionaire CEO told his friends his wife was infertile until she stormed into his brother's wedding with twins and a secret that shocked his family. She stood in the doorway of St. Augustine's Cathedral with a child on each side of her, and 300 people turned to look at the woman Mark Cox had told the entire world could never have children. His voice had carried across a terrace 4 years ago, smooth and casual, dripping with the kind of sympathy that only a liar can manufacture. Margaret can't have children. Her body just won't cooperate. We've seen every specialist in the Southeast. It's been tough, obviously. But what can you do? Some things aren't meant to be. 300 people had believed him. His parents had believed him. His business partners had believed him. His friends had sent sympathy cards and poured him extra bourbon and patted his shoulder like he was the victim of some cosmic injustice. And now those same people were staring at the doorway of this cathedral, watching Margaret walk in with 2 5-year-old children who had Mark Cox's jawline, Mark Cox's eyes, and the unmistakable look of children who had been raised by a woman strong enough to build an empire from nothing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I show you what happened in that cathedral, before I tell you how a billionaire's carefully constructed lie collapsed in front of every person who ever believed it, before I show you the moment Mark Cox looked into the faces of children he didn't know existed and realized that every choice he'd made for the last 6 years had been wrong, I need to take you back to where this story really began. Back to a gallery in Atlanta. Back to a woman named Margaret. Back to the night she fell in love with a man who would eventually try to erase her. If you've ever been lied about, if you've ever had someone reduce your worth to a story they told at dinner parties, if you've ever rebuilt your entire life from the wreckage someone else created, then this story was made for you. Like this video right now. Subscribe to Mr. Dawson Stories, and whatever you do, do not skip ahead, because nothing in this story goes the way you think it will. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Margaret Elaine Howard grew up in Savannah, Georgia, in a small house 3 blocks from the river, where the air always smelled like salt and magnolia and the particular sweetness of a life that didn't have much money but had more than enough love. Her mother, Cecilia, was a ceramicist, not the famous kind, not the kind who got gallery shows or magazine features, the kind who made bowls for the farmer's market on Saturday mornings, who shaped clay on a second-hand wheel in the garage while Margaret and her sister Gloria did homework at the kitchen table. Margaret grew up with clay under her fingernails. She grew up understanding that you could take something shapeless and raw, and with enough patience, enough pressure, enough heat, turn it into something that could hold things. Water, flowers, the weight of a moment too important for words. She studied fine arts at the Savannah College of Art and Design on a scholarship she'd worked 3 jobs to supplement. She was talented. Her professors said so. Her classmates said so. Margaret never trusted compliments the way she trusted clay. Clay didn't lie. Clay didn't tell you what you wanted to hear. Clay showed you exactly what it was, and either you had the skill to shape it or you didn't. She graduated at 22 and moved to Atlanta with a portfolio, $600 in savings, and the kind of ambition that comes from watching your mother make beautiful things that nobody with money ever noticed. Margaret was going to be noticed, not for vanity, for survival, for the belief that art could be both beautiful and functional, that the things we use every day deserve to be made with love. She got a job at a gallery in Buckhead, not as an artist, as an assistant. She answered phones and scheduled exhibitions and learned how the business side of art worked, while spending her nights in a rented studio space making her own pieces. Bowls that curved like cupped hands. Vases with deliberate asymmetry that made them look alive. Functional art that people touched before they thought about it because something in the shape invited contact. Her sister Gloria called every Sunday without fail. "How's the art?" Gloria would ask. Slow, Margaret would answer. "How's the money?" Slower. "Are you eating?" "Enough." "Are you happy?" "I'm working." "That's close enough." Gloria was 4 years older, a nurse in Savannah, practical where Margaret was creative, loud where Margaret was quiet, the kind of sister who would drive 4 hours at midnight if Margaret sounded even slightly wrong on the phone. They were each other's foundation, the one structure neither of them ever had to question. At 24, Margaret got her first exhibition, a small one, a group show at the gallery where she worked, her boss giving her wall space more as a favor than a vote of confidence. She displayed 7 pieces, each one named for something she'd learned about survival. There was a bowl called Held that fit perfectly in 2 hands. A vase called Still Here with a hairline crack sealed with gold in the Japanese kintsugi tradition. A set of cups called enough that were exactly the right size for one person's morning coffee. The night of the opening, the gallery was full of the kind of people Margaret had been observing for 2 years. Wealthy, polished, the sort who bought art the way they bought furniture, to fill spaces rather than to feel something. Margaret stood near her pieces in a dress she'd borrowed from Gloria and tried not to look like someone who was terrified. And then Mark Cox walked in. He was 36 years old, CEO of Cox Capital Partners, a private equity firm that managed portfolios worth more than some countries' GDP. He'd been on the cover of Atlanta Business Chronicle twice. Forbes had profiled him under the headline The Quiet Titan, which Margaret would later realize was exactly wrong. Mark Cox wasn't quiet. He was controlled. There's a difference, and it matters. He came with a group of business associates, men in suits that cost more than Margaret's rent, laughing the way wealthy men laugh, with full permission, taking up space like it was owed to them. Margaret noticed him the way you notice a change in weather. Something in the room shifted when he entered. Temperature, pressure, the invisible physics of attention. She expected him to walk past her work. Most of the suits did. They gravitated toward the large abstract paintings on the far wall. Bold colors, big canvases, the kind of art that announced itself from across the room. Margaret's ceramics were quieter. You had to come close. You had to look. Mark Cox came close. He stood in front of the bowl held for 3 full minutes without speaking. Margaret watched him from 10 feet away, pretending to adjust a price tag while studying his face for the expression she'd learned to recognize in 2 years of gallery work. The expression of someone who was actually seeing something, not just looking at it. He reached out and touched the rim of the bowl, tracing the curve with one finger, and Margaret almost stopped him. You weren't supposed to touch the art. But something about the way he did it, reverently, like he was reading Braille, made her stay silent. Then he turned and looked directly at her. You made this, he said. It wasn't a question. I did. It feels like it's waiting for something. Like it was made to hold something specific, but you haven't decided what yet. Margaret felt the hair on her arms stand up. Nobody had ever described her work that way. Nobody had ever come that close to what she was actually trying to do. Everything I make is like that, she said. I make vessels, things that hold other things. But what they hold is up to the person who takes them home. He bought the bowl, and the vase, and the entire set of cups called enough. He paid full price without negotiating, which in the gallery world was almost unheard of. And then he asked her to coffee. Not dinner, not drinks, coffee, as if he understood instinctively that Margaret was not a woman who would be impressed by expensive restaurants and wine lists. She was a woman who would be impressed by someone who paid attention. She said yes, against every instinct she developed in 2 years of watching wealthy people treat beautiful things as transactions. She said yes because of the way he'd touched the bowl, because of the word waiting, because sometimes your hands know what to do before your brain gives permission. Their courtship lasted 8 months. Mark was attentive in ways that felt almost studied, like he'd researched how to make a woman feel seen and was executing the findings with precision. He sent handwritten notes. He remembered details from conversations they'd had weeks earlier. He showed up at her studio unannounced with takeout and sat quietly while she worked, not demanding attention, just being present. He told her about his family, the Cox dynasty, as Atlanta society called them. His father, David, who'd built the original business. His mother, Patricia, who ran the social calendar like a military campaign. His younger brother, Patrick, the only Cox who seemed to have escaped the family gravitational field with his humanity intact. Patrick was an environmental lawyer. The family considered this a waste. Mark described this with a wry smile that suggested he agreed with his family's assessment, and Margaret filed that detail away as something to worry about later. She told him about Savannah, about her mother's ceramics, about Gloria, about growing up without money, but with the understanding that your hands could make something from nothing if you were patient enough. He listened, really listened, or seemed to. When he proposed, 9 months after the gallery opening, Margaret said yes for the same reason she'd said yes to coffee. Because he made her feel seen. Because he engaged with her art not as a hobby, but as a vocation. Because he'd built her a studio in the guest house of his Buckhead estate as an engagement gift, a proper studio with a professional kiln and a wheel that didn't wobble and shelves for finished pieces and natural light that made everything look like it was glowing. The wedding was large and expensive, and exactly what the Cox family expected. Margaret wore her mother's altered dress, Gloria was maid of honor. Patricia Cox smiled through the ceremony with the particular tightness of a woman who had opinions about her son's choice, but had been told to keep them to herself. Margaret noticed that tightness. She chose to ignore it. That was her first mistake, though she wouldn't recognize it as such for 3 more years. The early years of their marriage were good, not perfect. Margaret wasn't naive enough to expect perfection from a man who ran a billion-dollar company and had been raised to believe that control was the highest virtue, but good in the ways that mattered. They had morning coffee together at the kitchen island. They walked to Buckhead trails on Sunday afternoons. They cooked dinner together twice a week, Mark surprisingly competent with a chef's knife, Margaret providing the recipes her mother had taught her over the phone. He was proud of her work. He displayed her pieces throughout their home. He introduced her at events as Margaret, the artist, and the way he said it, with genuine admiration, made her feel like maybe she'd been wrong to be cautious. Maybe some wealthy men actually valued substance over surface. Maybe Mark Cox was the exception to every rule she'd learned in the gallery. She wanted children almost immediately. The desire lived in her body, not just her mind. A cellular longing, ancient and persistent, the kind of wanting that doesn't respond to logic or timing or circumstance. She wanted to hold something she'd made that wasn't clay. Something that breathed and cried and grew into its own shape without her having to decide what it would become. Mark said he wanted children too. He said all the right things. He talked about legacy and family and the home they'd build together. But Margaret noticed even then that his enthusiasm had a rehearsed quality, like he was performing desire rather than feeling it, like children were a line item on a life plan rather than a longing in his bones. They tried for 2 years, month after month, the hope and the disappointment becoming a rhythm that Margaret's body learned the way it learned the rhythm of the wheel. Anticipation, effort, waiting, loss. Anticipation, effort, waiting, loss. The fertility specialists came next. Margaret endured every test, every procedure, every clinical conversation about her reproductive capacity with the stoic determination of a woman who believed that if she just tried hard enough, worked hard enough, wanted it badly enough, her body would cooperate. She'd spent her entire life making things from raw material. This couldn't be the one thing she couldn't make. The doctors were careful with their language. Unexplained infertility, they called it. Both partners showing normal results individually. No clear physiological barrier. Sometimes conception simply required patience. Sometimes it required intervention. Sometimes it happened when you stopped trying so hard. Margaret heard nuance. She heard possibility. She heard we don't know yet, which was different from we know it won't happen. Mark heard something else entirely, or chose to, because 3 years into their marriage, at the annual Cox Capital Partners dinner at their Buckhead estate, Mark stood in the garden below the terrace where Margaret was getting air and told his friends the version of the story he decided was true. The evening had been long. Margaret had spent all day preparing. Flowers from the florist Patricia had recommended, which was Patricia's way of maintaining control without appearing to. Catering from the company Patricia used, because Cox Events had standards. A dress Margaret had bought specifically for the occasion because she'd learned that the wrong outfit at a Cox function generated the kind of whispered commentary that lasted for months. She'd smiled and made conversation and performed the role of CEO's wife with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been performing it for 3 years and still hadn't learned to do it effortlessly. Some women were built for this world. Margaret was built for a studio with clay under her nails and silence thick enough to think in. But she loved Mark. And love, she believed then, meant showing up for someone else's life even when it didn't fit yours. By 10 o'clock, the noise inside was oppressive. Laughter that was too loud, conversations that were too performative, the particular energy of wealthy people competing to appear the most successful while pretending they weren't competing at all. Margaret slipped through the French doors onto the upper terrace, breathing in the cool night air, grateful for the silence. And then she heard Mark's voice. It drifted up from the garden below, carried by the acoustics of the stone walls and the stillness of the night. He was standing with 4 men. Margaret could see the tops of their heads, the amber glow of bourbon in crystal glasses, the lazy curl of cigar smoke rising into the dark. Margaret can't have children, Mark was saying. His tone was casual, conversational, the way you'd discuss a stock that underperformed or a vacation that fell through. We've been through every specialist in the Southeast. Her body just won't cooperate. Margaret's hand found the iron railing. She gripped it so hard the metal pressed lines into her palm that would still be visible the next morning. It's been tough, obviously, Mark continued. I mean, you want to build a family, you want to carry on what your father started, and then you find out that the one thing you need your wife to do is the one thing she can't. But what can you do? Some things aren't meant to be. A murmur of sympathy from the group. Someone said, "Damn, Mark, I'm sorry." Someone else said, "Have you considered surrogacy?" A third voice, lower, said something Margaret couldn't quite hear that made the others laugh uncomfortably. Mark's response was clear enough. We've accepted it. Margaret's handling it as well as she can. It's harder for her, obviously. Women tie so much of their identity to motherhood. But we're making peace with it. Making peace with it. Margaret stood on the terrace above the man she'd married and listened to him turn her body into a public failure. She listened to him harvest sympathy he hadn't earned by assigning blame she didn't deserve. She listened to him describe their shared struggle as her individual deficiency and position himself as the noble husband, bearing the burden of a broken wife. And the worst part, the part that would keep her awake for years afterward, the worst part was that it wasn't true. The doctors had never said she was infertile. They'd said the cause was unexplained. They'd said both partners showed normal results. They'd said patience and intervention, and sometimes these things take time. Mark hadn't reported what the doctors said. He'd edited it. He'd taken ambiguity and sculpted it into a verdict, and he'd placed that verdict entirely on her. Margaret didn't move from the terrace for 20 minutes. She stood there while the party hummed below her and the garden conversation shifted to golf and quarterly earnings, as if her body's supposed failure was just another topic between holes and spreadsheets. She stood there while something fundamental shifted inside her. Not broke. She was too strong to break, but shifted. Tectonic plates moving, slow and massive and irreversible. She didn't confront Mark that night. She'd learned by the 3rd year of their marriage that confrontation with Mark was an exercise in frustration. He had an answer for everything. He could reframe any accusation as a misunderstanding, any legitimate grievance as an overreaction, any pain she expressed as evidence of her emotional instability rather than his wrongdoing. He was a man who'd built a billion-dollar company on the power of persuasion, and he applied those same skills to his marriage with devastating efficiency. So Margaret went quiet, but not the quiet of defeat, the quiet of observation, the quiet of a woman who has just discovered that the foundation she built her life on has a crack running through it and needs to determine how deep it goes before deciding whether to repair or demolish. She began watching Mark the way she watched clay on the wheel, carefully, patiently, looking for the tells that revealed what was really underneath, the late nights that didn't align with his calendar. She checked. She cross-referenced his claimed meetings with the company schedule his assistant sent to her email and found gaps. Tuesday evenings he said he was with investors, Thursday dinners that ran late, the occasional weekend business trip that seemed to produce no follow-up emails or conference materials, the phone calls he took in other rooms, not all of them, just certain ones. He'd glance at the screen, and something in his expression would shift, a microsecond of adjustment before he'd say, "I need to take this," and close the door behind him. The women at events who looked at Margaret with something between pity and triumph. She'd noticed these looks before but had attributed them to the general competitiveness of Atlanta society women. Now she recognized them for what they were, knowledge. These women knew something Margaret didn't, and the knowing gave them power they enjoyed. 3 weeks after the terrace, Margaret found confirmation. It was a Saturday morning. Mark was at the gym. He'd left his laptop open on the kitchen island, which he almost never did because Mark was meticulous about security. Later, Margaret would wonder if some unconscious part of him wanted to be caught. If even the most accomplished liars eventually grew tired of the performance and left a door unlocked just to see what would happen. She wasn't looking for evidence. She was looking for a recipe she'd bookmarked on his browser. But the messages were right there, in an open tab, a conversation thread with a woman named Anessa. And the content was unambiguous. Margaret read them standing in the kitchen she'd decorated, wearing the robe he'd bought her for Christmas, the morning light coming through the window she'd chosen, surrounded by the life she'd built inside a marriage that was apparently a shell. The messages stretched back 18 months. 18 months of parallel lives, of Mark climbing into their bed smelling like expensive soap that covered the scent of someone else. 18 months of fertility appointments where he'd held her hand and looked at ultrasound screens and said, "We'll keep trying, honey," while maintaining a relationship that made keeping trying a performance rather than a genuine desire. Margaret read every message, not because she wanted to, because she needed to understand the full architecture of the betrayal. She needed to see the load-bearing walls, the foundation stress, the structural engineering of a lie that had been built to last. She was a woman who understood construction. She needed to see how this particular building had been designed, so she'd know exactly how to bring it down. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't call Gloria, though her hands ached to dial. Instead, she photographed every message with methodical precision. Screenshot after screenshot, time-stamped, organized, the evidence cataloged with the care of someone who understood that documentation was power and emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Then she closed the laptop. She washed her coffee mug. She went upstairs and pulled 2 suitcases from the closet. She packed the way she did everything. Deliberately. She took her clothes, her jewelry that was hers rather than gifts from Mark, her sketchbooks, her laptop, the small clay figure her mother had made for her when she was 7, a woman holding a bowl above her head, like an offering or a shield. She left behind everything Mark had bought for her. Every designer dress, every piece of expensive jewelry, every artifact of the life she'd been performing for 3 years. She left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter. Next to it, she placed a note. 5 words. I heard you on the terrace. She drove to Savannah. 4 hours on I-16 with the windows down, the radio off, and a silence inside her that was deeper than any silence she'd ever known. It wasn't empty silence. It was the silence of a structure that has just experienced a seismic event and hasn't yet determined what survived. Gloria was home. Gloria was always home when Margaret needed her, as if some cellular connection between sisters transmitted distress signals across distance. She opened the door, took one look at Margaret's face, and pulled her inside without asking a single question. Margaret made it to the couch before the crying started. It lasted 3 days. Not continuously. In waves. She'd stop, eat something Gloria put in front of her, sleep for an hour, then wake, and the grief would crash over her again with the force of something that had been held back too long. On the 4th day, she stopped crying. She showered. She sat at Gloria's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and said, I need a plan. Gloria sat across from her with the calm of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this sentence. What do you need? A divorce. A place to live that isn't Atlanta. A lawyer who's smarter than Mark's lawyers. Gloria nodded. What about the money? I don't want his money. I want my life back. Your life costs money, Margaret. Especially if you're starting over. Take what you're owed and use it to build something. Don't let pride make you stupid. Margaret looked at her sister. The word stupid stung, but Gloria had never been the kind of sister who softened truth to protect feelings. She was the kind who delivered truth like medicine, bitter, necessary, and administered with love. You're right, Margaret said. Okay. She called a lawyer that afternoon, a woman named Diane Ashford from a firm in Savannah that Gloria's colleague had recommended. Someone who handles situations like yours, the colleague had said, and Margaret understood that situations like yours meant wealthy, powerful men who expected to win. The divorce proceedings began, and Mark didn't fight. That was the part Margaret hadn't expected, and the part that wounded her most deeply. She'd prepared for battle. She'd cataloged evidence, organized documentation, built a case that could withstand the full force of Cox Capital Partners' legal team. And Mark just agreed to everything. The division of assets, the terms of separation, the quiet, efficient dissolution of a marriage that had apparently meant so little to him that he couldn't even be bothered to contest its ending. His lawyer sent the settlement offer, generous by legal standards, a sum that reflected 3 years of marriage to a billionaire, calculated with the cold precision of a man who understood that paying the right price for silence was simply good business. Margaret took it, not because it was fair, because Gloria was right. Pride was a luxury. Capital was a tool. And Margaret had plans. It was during the 2nd week at Gloria's apartment that Margaret's body delivered its verdict on the cosmic joke that had become her life. She was exhausted. She was nauseous. She attributed both to grief and stress and the particular physical toll of crying for 3 days straight. But Gloria, the nurse, noticed things Margaret was too shattered to notice herself. When's the last time you had your period? Gloria asked one morning over breakfast. Margaret looked up from the toast she wasn't eating. What? Your period. When was the last one? I don't know. I've been dealing with the end of my marriage. I wasn't exactly tracking my cycle. Gloria was already standing, reaching for her keys. We're going to the doctor. I'm not sick, Gloria. I'm heartbroken. There's no test for that. There's a test for why you've been throwing up every morning for a week, Gloria replied. Get your shoes on. The doctor's office was the same one they'd visited as children. Dr. Patel, who'd been ancient when they were teenagers and was somehow still practicing, still wearing the same wire-rimmed glasses, still calling every patient sweetheart. The blood test took 10 minutes. The results took an eternity. Margaret sat on the exam table, that crinkly paper beneath her, and stared at a poster about hand hygiene while her entire future rearranged itself behind her eyes. She wasn't thinking about Mark. She wasn't thinking about the divorce. She was thinking about her mother's clay figure, the woman holding the bowl above her head. Dr. Patel came back with a smile that changed the temperature of the room. Congratulations, sweetheart. You're pregnant. Margaret heard the words, processed them, failed to respond. Based on your levels, I'd estimate about 8 weeks along, Dr. Patel continued. We should schedule an ultrasound to confirm the timeline and check on everything. 8 weeks. Margaret's brain did the math. 8 weeks ago, she'd still been in the Buckhead house, still performing the role of Mark Cox's wife, still sleeping beside a man who was sleeping with someone else. 8 weeks ago, she'd been a woman her husband told people couldn't have children. I need an ultrasound, Margaret said. Her voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere else. Today. Can we do it today? Dr. Patel studied her face, then nodded. Let me see what I can arrange. An hour later, Margaret lay on a table in a dim room, cold gel on her stomach, a technician moving the wand with the casual competence of someone who did this 40 times a day. The sound came first, a heartbeat, fast and rhythmic and unmistakable, but wrong somehow, too complex, too layered. The technician's hand paused. She adjusted the wand, looked at the screen, adjusted again. Well, she said, with the controlled surprise of a professional who has just found something unexpected. There are 2 of them. 2 what? Margaret whispered. 2 heartbeats. You're carrying twins. The screen showed 2 small figures, curled toward each other like parentheses, like a sentence that hadn't been finished yet, like 2 halves of a story waiting to be told. Gloria, who had insisted on being in the room, grabbed Margaret's hand so hard that Margaret felt the bones shift. Oh, Margaret. Oh, honey. Margaret stared at the screen. 2 children. 2 heartbeats. The woman her husband had told the world was infertile was carrying twins. She sat in the parking lot of the doctor's office for 45 minutes after the appointment. Gloria sat beside her, silent for once, understanding that some moments required witness rather than words. Margaret held the ultrasound image in both hands. 2 small lives. 2 futures. 2 human beings who would carry pieces of her and pieces of Mark and pieces of something entirely their own. She had a choice to make. She could tell Mark. By law, by convention, by every expectation of civilized society, she probably should. He was the biological father. He had rights. He had resources. He had the kind of money that could provide every advantage these children would ever need. But Margaret sat in that parking lot and replayed his voice on the terrace. Margaret can't have children. Her body just won't cooperate. She replayed 18 months of infidelity disguised as devotion. She replayed every fertility appointment where he'd held her hand while maintaining a relationship with another woman. She replayed the way he'd turned her body into a public failure and her struggle into a sympathy card. And she made her decision. She would not tell Mark Cox. Not out of spite, though God knew she'd earned the right. Not out of revenge, though the thought of him discovering the truth someday gave her a satisfaction she wasn't proud of. She would not tell him because she had listened to this man reduce her to a medical failure in front of his peers, had discovered his infidelity woven through the same months he'd been holding her hand in fertility clinics, and she understood with the kind of clarity that comes only from devastation that Mark Cox was not a man who deserved to shape the lives of children, a man who lies about his wife's body to harvest sympathy, a man who cheats on his partner while she undergoes medical procedures to give him the legacy he claims to want, a man who treats marriage as a performance and fidelity as optional. That man does not get to be a father by default. Fatherhood is earned, and Mark Cox hadn't earned anything. Gloria, Margaret said finally. Yeah, I'm moving. Not back to Atlanta. Somewhere new. Somewhere I can start over. Where? Charleston. It's close enough that you can visit. Far enough that nobody knows my name. Gloria looked at her sister, looked at the ultrasound image in her hands, looked at the expression on Margaret's face, which was no longer grief or shock or fury, but something harder and more productive. Determination. Okay, Gloria said. Let's build you a life. Now I need to pause right here and talk to you directly. Because this moment, this woman sitting in a parking lot with an ultrasound of twins she never expected, making a decision that will reshape 3 lives forever, this moment is where the real story begins. Everything before this was prologue. The marriage, the betrayal, the lies on the terrace. All of it was just the fire. What comes next is what survived the kiln. If you're watching this and you've ever had to make a decision that felt impossible, if you've ever chosen survival over comfort, truth over convenience, your children over your pain, then you understand what Margaret is feeling right now. And you understand that what she does next is going to take more courage than anything she's ever done. Like this video, if you're rooting for Margaret, share it with someone who's in the middle of their own impossible decision. Subscribe to Mr. Dawson's stories because we are just getting started. And trust me when I tell you, what happens next will shock you. Now let me tell you about Charleston. Margaret arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, on a Tuesday afternoon in July with 2 suitcases, a settlement check, a growing belly, and the kind of focus that only comes from having exactly one option: forward. She rented a small house near the water, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with windows that faced the harbor, a yard just big enough for a garden. It wasn't the Buckhead estate. It wasn't marble and imported Italian fixtures and walk-in closets the size of Gloria's entire apartment. It was small and slightly run down, and it smelled like old wood and sea salt and possibility. Margaret stood in the empty living room on her first night and pressed her hands against her stomach where 2 lives were taking shape and said out loud, to no one and everyone, "We're going to be okay." She enrolled in the business program at the College of Charleston, not because she'd abandoned art, because she understood now that art without business was just a hobby, and hobbies didn't feed twins. She needed to learn how to turn what her hands could make into something that would sustain 3 lives. The pregnancy was difficult. Twins are always difficult, her new OB told her, with the cheerful bluntness of a woman who had delivered thousands of babies and lost patience for sugarcoating sometime around baby number 500. But Margaret's body, the body Mark Cox had publicly declared defective, performed this particular miracle with stubborn efficiency, as if it had been waiting for the right moment, as if it had known all along what it was capable of and had simply been biding its time until the conditions were worthy. Gloria flew in from Savannah every other weekend. She'd arrive on Friday evening with groceries, clean Margaret's house whether Margaret wanted it cleaned or not, and spend Saturday rubbing Margaret's swollen feet while they watched movies and talked about everything except Mark Cox. "You need to eat more protein," Gloria would say. "You're growing 2 humans. They need building materials. I'm eating plenty. You just think everyone's underfed because you're a nurse. I think you're underfed because I can see your collarbone and you're 7 months pregnant. Eat the chicken." In her business classes, Margaret met Rosalind Peters. Rosalind was 38, divorced, raising a daughter alone, and pursuing her MBA with the ferocity of someone who had something to prove to every person who'd ever underestimated her. She'd been married to a man who drained their savings on gambling debts and then blamed her for not earning enough to cover them. Margaret and Rosalind recognized each other immediately, not physically, spiritually, the way survivors recognize other survivors, the way women who've been broken by men who were supposed to protect them recognize the particular set of the jaw that means I will never be that vulnerable again. They became business partners before they became friends. Rosalind had the marketing mind Margaret lacked. She understood branding and positioning and the particular alchemy of turning a product into a story that people wanted to buy. Margaret had the product. Rosalind had the plan. Vessel and clay, Rosalind said one afternoon over coffee and spreadsheets, both of them visibly pregnant. Rosalind with her second and Margaret with her twins. That should be the name, because that's what you do. You make vessels, things that hold other things, and clay is where everything starts, raw, shapeless, waiting to become. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She blamed the hormones. It was probably the hormones, but it was also the experience of being understood by someone who actually listened. The twins arrived on a stormy March night. DeAndre came first. He entered the world with his eyes open, which the nurses said was unusual and Margaret found entirely appropriate. Her son was born looking, observing, taking in data about this new environment with the focused attention of someone who intended to understand everything before committing to an opinion. Deja arrived 11 minutes later screaming, not crying, screaming, with the full-throated fury of a person who had opinions about the world before she'd even seen it. She screamed through her first bath. She screamed through her first feeding. She screamed until a nurse placed her next to DeAndre in the bassinet, and then she went immediately silent, curling toward her brother like a parenthesis finding its pair. Margaret held them, one in each arm, both impossibly light, both impossibly heavy, and understood for the first time what it meant to be complete. Not happy, not yet. Completeness and happiness were different currencies, and Margaret had learned to stop confusing them. But complete, whole, a vessel that finally held what it was made to hold. She named them with intention. DeAndre, meaning brave. Deja, meaning already. Together, their names were a sentence. Already brave, because that's what they were. Born into a story that began with betrayal and abandonment, and already brave enough to be here anyway. The first year was survival. Pure, undiluted, unglamorous survival. Margaret existed in a fog of sleep deprivation, formula stains, and the constant low-grade terror of being solely responsible for two human beings who couldn't yet hold up their own heads. Gloria came every weekend now, not every other. She'd arrive on Friday night, take over baby duties, and physically put Margaret to bed. Sleep, she'd order. I've got them. They're fine. You're the one falling apart. I'm not falling apart, Margaret would protest. I'm just tired. You're exhausted, and there's a difference. Tired is fixable. Exhausted is dangerous. Sleep. During the week, Margaret attended classes with the twins in a double stroller, parked outside the lecture hall where she could see them through the window. Her professors were understanding, mostly. One wasn't. An economics professor named Dr. Alderman, who told her that perhaps she should consider deferring until her personal situation was more stable. Margaret looked at Dr. Alderman, a man in his 60s who had never, she was certain, held a crying infant at 3 a.m. while simultaneously reviewing cash flow projections. My personal situation, Margaret said quietly, is that I have 2 children who need to eat and a brain that needs to learn how to build a business that feeds them. If my stroller in the hallway is disruptive, I'll move it. But I'm not deferring. I'm not waiting for a convenient moment that doesn't exist. I'm here. They're here. We're staying. Dr. Alderman didn't bring it up again. Rosalind became her co-pilot. Their business partnership solidified during the twins' first year, the two of them building a brand plan around Margaret's ceramics while their children crawled around their feet. Rosalind's daughter, Nina, was 3 months older than the twins, and the 3 babies developed the kind of bond that happens when proximity becomes permanence. Vessel and Clay launched online when DeAndre and Deja were 14 months old. Margaret had spent the previous year creating inventory. Pieces made during nap times, during the 20-minute windows between feedings, during the precious hours after the twins went to sleep when her body wanted rest, but her hands wanted clay. Each piece was named. A bowl called Storm, made the night of a particularly bad thunderstorm, when both twins were screaming and Margaret was crying, and the clay was the only thing in the house that wasn't making noise. A vase called March, tall and slender with 2 subtle curves near the base that only Margaret knew represented her children. A set of mugs called 4 a.m., rough-textured and imperfect, made during the hours when Margaret was too tired to aim for perfection and accidentally discovered that imperfection was more beautiful. The response was immediate. A lifestyle blogger with 3 million followers ordered the 4 a.m. mugs and posted about them with the caption, "Made by a single mother at 4 a.m. while her twins slept. Tell me these aren't the most honest pieces of art you've ever seen." The post went viral. Orders flooded in. Then came the email from Architectural Digest. "We'd like to feature your work," the editor wrote. "And your story." Margaret hesitated. Her story meant Mark. Her story meant explaining why a woman with this talent had been invisible for 3 years. Her story meant the terrace and the lie and the man who'd told the world she was broken. Rosalind convinced her. "You don't have to mention him," Rosalind said. "Your story isn't about him. It's about what you built after. He's the fire. You're what survived the kiln." The Architectural Digest feature ran when the twins were 18 months old. It focused on Margaret's art, her process, her philosophy of functional beauty. The photographs showed her studio, her hands covered in clay, her finished pieces arranged on shelves like a library of survival. One photo showed the twins sitting on the studio floor, DeAndre solemnly examining a bowl and Deja attempting to eat a lump of clay. The feature didn't mention Mark Cox. It didn't need to. Margaret's story was powerful enough without him. A woman who took raw material, the shapeless, messy, uncertain substance of her own devastation, and formed it into something that could hold beauty. Orders tripled, then tripled again. Rosalind hired a production team. They opened a retail space in downtown Charleston, then a second location in Savannah because Margaret wanted her mother's city to be part of the story. Then a third in Nashville because the numbers supported it and Rosalind had a gift for reading markets. By the time DeAndre and Deja were 5 years old, Vessel and Clay employed 47 people across 3 locations. Margaret's net worth had climbed past $8 million. She'd been featured in Elle Decor, Southern Living, and a New York Times profile that called her one of the most important voices in American functional art. She'd built an empire, not the marble and glass kind that Mark Cox inhabited, the clay and gold kind, the kind you build with your hands from material everyone else discards. And through all of it, every late night and early morning, every business crisis and creative breakthrough, every moment of doubt and every moment of triumph, DeAndre and Deja were there, growing, becoming, turning into people who were entirely their own, while carrying pieces of both parents in their faces and mannerisms and the particular way they approached the world. DeAndre was his mother's son in temperament, quiet, observant, analytical. He built things constantly, block towers as a toddler, then Lego structures, then elaborate models made from cardboard and tape and whatever materials he could find. When his towers fell, he studied the wreckage with clinical attention, identified the structural weakness, and rebuilt them stronger. He was 5 years old and already understood intuitively what most adults never learn. That failure isn't the opposite of success. It's the blueprint for it. He drew buildings in a notebook Margaret had given him for his 4th birthday. Not childish drawings, precise, measured sketches that showed an instinct for proportion and balance that his kindergarten teacher called remarkable and Margaret called terrifying. He had Mark's eyes. She saw it every time he looked up from his notebook with that focused, penetrating gaze that missed nothing. Mark's eyes in her son's face, asking questions about structural engineering that no 5-year-old should know how to ask. Deja was a different force entirely. She was loud where DeAndre was quiet. She was color where he was line. She insisted on yellow, everything yellow, because yellow was the color of brave, and she intended to be brave about everything. She collected toy dragons with the seriousness of a museum curator, each one named, each one assigned a personality and backstory and role in the elaborate fantasy kingdom she'd constructed in her imagination. She sang constantly, made up songs about everything, songs about breakfast and bath time and the specific injustice of having to wear shoes when feet were clearly designed to be free. She had Mark's smile, wide and sudden and capable of filling a room, and Margaret saw it every time Deja laughed and felt the complicated ache of loving something that reminded you of someone who hurt you. Together, the twins were an ecosystem. DeAndre the structure, Deja the chaos, each one incomplete without the other. They fought the way all siblings fight, with passion and unfairness and the absolute certainty that the other one was wrong about everything. But they also protected each other with a ferocity that suggested they understood, even at 5, that they were a unit, a team, 2 halves of a sentence that only made sense together. Already brave, Margaret raised them with honesty calibrated to their age. When DeAndre asked why they didn't have a father, Margaret said, "You do have a father. He's just not part of our life right now." When Deja asked if their father was dead, Margaret said, "No, baby, he's alive. The situation is complicated." When DeAndre, with his father's directness, asked, "Complicated how?" Margaret said, "I'll explain everything when you're old enough to understand. For now, what you need to know is that you are loved, completely, by me, by Aunt Gloria, by everyone in our life. And that is enough." It was enough. Margaret made sure of it. She built a life so full and so stable and so rich with love that the absence of a father was a question mark rather than a wound. The twins didn't feel lack. They felt abundance, and Margaret considered that her greatest achievement. Greater than the business, greater than the magazine features, greater than the $8 million. She had given her children a life where they didn't feel the shape of what was missing. But she knew, even as she built those walls of protection and abundance, that someday the question mark would demand an answer. Someday DeAndre's analytical mind would require facts, not reassurances. Someday Deja's emotional intelligence would detect the thing Margaret was hiding. Someday she'd have to explain why their father wasn't there, what he'd done, what she'd done, and let them decide for themselves what to feel about it. She just didn't expect someday to arrive in the form of a cream-colored envelope with gold embossing. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday. Margaret was at the kitchen table reviewing expansion plans for Vessel and Clay's 4th location while the twins ate breakfast around her. DeAndre was reading a book about famous bridges. Deja was attempting to feed scrambled eggs to her stuffed dragon Queenie with limited success. The mail was the usual mix of bills and catalogs and promotional materials. Margaret sorted through it with half her attention until her fingers found the envelope. Heavy cardstock, gold lettering, the kind of stationery that announces itself as important before you even open it. Patrick James Cox and Simone Elise Laurent request the honor of your presence at the celebration of their marriage. Margaret set the invitation on the table between a juice box and a permission slip for DeAndre's field trip. The collision of her past and present in one surreal moment. Patrick, Mark's younger brother, the kind one. He'd called Margaret after the divorce. Not immediately. 2 weeks later, once the initial shock had settled and the family lines had been drawn. He'd called and said, "Margaret, I just want you to know that I think my brother is a fool. I don't know everything that happened, and I don't need to. But I know you, and I know him, and I know which one of you I'd trust with my life. I'm sorry." It was the only call she'd received from anyone in the Cox family. The only acknowledgement that she was a person rather than a problem to be managed. And it had meant more than Patrick probably knew. They'd stayed loosely in touch over the 5 years since. Occasional texts, a birthday card he sent every year without fail, a message when Vessel and Clay was featured in the Times. Nothing that crossed the line into the Cox family territory. Just the quiet maintenance of a connection between two decent people who refused to let someone else's failures sever something genuine. And now, Patrick was getting married. And he'd invited her. Margaret stared at the invitation while Deja attempted to pour orange juice for Queenie, and DeAndre turned a page in his bridge book, and the morning light came through the kitchen windows and landed on the gold lettering like a spotlight. She knew what attending would mean. Mark would be there. Best man, almost certainly, because Cox family events had roles and expectations. And Mark was the eldest son, the CEO, the face of the dynasty. Patricia and David would be there. The entire social network that had witnessed Mark's lie about her infertility would be there. The men from the garden who'd heard Mark describe her body as defective would be there. And Margaret would walk in with twins. She could decline, send a gift, write a gracious note, maintain the careful, comfortable distance she'd cultivated for 5 years. Stay in her lane, stay safe. Stay invisible. But something had been building in Margaret for 5 years. Slowly, steadily, like pressure beneath the earth's surface. Something that demanded release, not revenge. Something more complicated. Something closer to truth. She picked up her phone and called Patrick. He answered on the second ring. "Margaret?" His voice carried genuine pleasure. "Did you get the invitation?" "I did. It's beautiful. Congratulations, Patrick." "Thank you. Simone is incredible. You'll love her. She's a human rights attorney who somehow also knows how to arrange flowers. I'm slightly terrified of her." Margaret smiled despite the weight of what she was about to say. "She sounds perfect for you." "She is. So, are you coming? I know it's complicated. I know he'll be there. But I want you there, Margaret. You were always the best part of that family, and we lost you when we shouldn't have." Margaret closed her eyes. "I want to come, but Patrick, I need to tell you something before I do. Something that's going to change how you see this entire situation." "Okay." He said it carefully, the way people say it when they sense that what's coming is larger than the word okay can hold. "I have children, Patrick. Twins, a boy and a girl. They're 5 years old. They were born 9 months after I left Atlanta." The silence on the other end of the line was so complete that Margaret could hear Patrick breathing. Slow, measured breaths that suggested he was processing information that had just restructured his understanding of the last 5 years. 5 years old, he repeated. 9 months after you left. Yes. They're Mark's. Yes. Does he know? No. The breathing continued. Margaret waited. She owed Patrick this space. She owed him the time to feel whatever he was going to feel about this revelation before she asked him to participate in it. "My God, Margaret," Patrick said finally. His voice was rough with emotion. 5 years. You've been raising his children for 5 years, and he doesn't know they exist. He told people I was infertile, Patrick. He stood in a garden and told his friends my body was broken while he was sleeping with another woman. The doctors never said I was infertile. He made that up. He turned my pain into his sympathy card. So no, I didn't tell him. Because a man who lies about his wife's body to make himself look noble doesn't get to know about the children that body produced. Patrick was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, His voice was steady with the particular resolve of a man who has just decided something important. "Bring them," he said. "Bring your children to my wedding. It's time this family reckoned with the truth." Margaret felt something release in her chest, something she'd been holding for 5 years without realizing how heavy it had become. "Are you sure?" she asked. "It's your wedding, Patrick. This will overshadow everything." "My wedding is about honesty," Patrick replied. "About choosing someone and meaning it. About building something real in a family that has spent too long building things that look good from the outside and are hollow at the center. If my wedding becomes the place where truth finally shows up, then that's the most meaningful thing that could happen. Bring them. I'll save you seats near the front." Margaret hung up the phone. She looked at the twins. DeAndre had finished his bridge book and was now sketching a suspension bridge in his notebook. Deja had given up on feeding Queenie and was eating the scrambled eggs herself while humming a song about a dragon who could fly to the moon. 2 weeks, Margaret thought. In 2 weeks, everything changes. She didn't tell the twins about Mark, not yet. Some truths needed context, and context required presence. She told them they were going to a wedding. DeAndre asked who was getting married. Deja asked if there would be cake. "There will definitely be cake," Margaret promised. "Then I'm in," Deja declared with the finality of someone who has weighed the evidence and reached a verdict. "DeAndre, we're going to a wedding." "I heard," DeAndre said without looking up from his sketch. "Will there be interesting architecture?" "It's a cathedral," Margaret said. "Very old, lots of columns." DeAndre's head came up. His eyes, Mark's eyes, lit with the kind of enthusiasm he reserved for structural wonders. "What kind of columns?" "I'll find out," Margaret promised. And despite everything, despite the terror and the anticipation and the 5 years of silence that were about to end, she smiled, because her children were extraordinary, and they were about to walk into a room full of people who didn't know they existed, and nothing would ever be the same. The morning of Patrick Cox's wedding arrived with the kind of golden September light that makes everything look like it was designed for a photograph. Margaret stood in the bathroom of their hotel suite in Atlanta, gripping the edge of the marble vanity, staring at her reflection with the intensity of a woman preparing for battle. She looked good. She knew she looked good, and the knowing was important because this wasn't vanity. This was armor. The dress was emerald green, fitted but not flashy. The kind of dress that said, "I didn't come here to compete. I came here to exist." Her hair was pulled back in a low twist that showed her face fully. No hiding, no softening. She wore her mother's pearl earrings and a gold bracelet she'd bought herself on the day vessel, and clay turned its first profit. Every piece of jewelry on her body represented something she'd earned rather than something she'd been given. In the main room of the suite, the twins were having a disagreement about shoes. "I don't want to wear the shiny ones," DeAndre said with the particular stubbornness of a child who has made a decision and considers the matter permanently closed. "They're uncomfortable, and they make a clicking sound on the floor. I'll sound like a horse." "You'll look handsome," Margaret called from the bathroom. "And horses are majestic animals, so that's not the insult you think it is." Deja was already dressed in her sunflower yellow dress, standing in front of the full-length mirror with the self-assurance of a 5-year-old who understood that she had made an excellent fashion choice. She'd insisted on this dress. Margaret had suggested something more subdued, maybe navy blue or forest green, something that blended. Deja had looked at her mother with an expression that combined pity and disbelief. "Mama, you don't blend at a wedding. You bloom." Margaret hadn't argued after that. "Are there going to be a lot of people?" DeAndre asked, finally submitting to the shiny shoes with visible reluctance. "Yes," Margaret said, emerging from the bathroom and crouching down to his level. "A lot of people. Most of them won't know who we are. Some of them might stare. If anyone makes you uncomfortable, you tell me immediately, okay?" "Why would they stare?" Margaret hesitated. She'd thought carefully about how much to tell them before the wedding. Too much information would overwhelm them. Too little would leave them unprepared. She'd chosen a middle path that felt inadequate but was the best she could manage. "Because we're guests they weren't expecting," Margaret said. "And sometimes when people are surprised, they stare. It doesn't mean anything bad. It just means they're curious." "I don't mind people staring," Deja announced. "It means they're paying attention." DeAndre looked less convinced but didn't press further. He picked up his notebook, the one he carried everywhere, and tucked his pencil behind his ear like a miniature architect heading to a job site. "Can I draw the cathedral?" he asked. If you're quiet about it, yes. I'm always quiet, DeAndre pointed out. Deja's the loud one. Being loud isn't a flaw, Deja countered. It's a feature. Margaret looked at her children. These two extraordinary humans she'd built and raised and protected for 5 years. They had no idea what they were walking into. They had no idea that somewhere in that cathedral, a man who shared their DNA would see them for the first time and have to confront the fact that his entire narrative about his marriage, his wife, his supposed tragedy of childlessness was a lie he'd manufactured and sold to anyone who would buy it. She should feel guilty for using her children as instruments of truth. She'd wrestled with that guilt for 2 weeks. Was this about them or about her? Was she bringing them to this wedding for their benefit or for the satisfaction of watching Mark Cox's carefully constructed world collapse? The honest answer was both, and Margaret had decided that both was acceptable, because her children deserved to exist openly. They deserved to walk into a room without shame. They deserved to stop being a secret. And if the revelation of their existence also happened to demolish a lie that had caused her immeasurable pain, well, truth doesn't owe anyone comfort. Let's go, Margaret said. She took Deja's hand in her right and DeAndre's in her left, and the three of them walked out of the hotel suite and into the rest of their lives. The drive to St. Augustine's Cathedral took 20 minutes. Margaret used the time to review the plan in her head. Patrick had reserved seats for them in the 4th row, not the very front, but close enough to be visible. Close enough that Mark, standing at the altar as best man, would be able to see them clearly when they entered. Patrick had offered to warn Mark in advance. Margaret had declined. She'd considered it. She'd spent 3 sleepless nights considering it. But ultimately, she'd decided that Mark Cox had been controlling the narrative about their relationship for 5 years. He'd decided when and how to share information about her body. He'd decided what version of their story the world would hear. He'd decided, without her consent, to turn her into a character in his personal mythology, the tragic wife who couldn't give him children. So Margaret decided she'd control this narrative. The truth would arrive on her terms, in her timing, in the way she chose. Not as a phone call he could prepare for, not as a letter he could craft a response to, but as a living, breathing, undeniable reality walking through a cathedral door. Was it kind? No. Was it fair? Margaret had stopped concerning herself with fairness the night she stood on a terrace and listened to her husband lie about her body. Fairness was a luxury for people whose lives hadn't been shaped by someone else's dishonesty. The cathedral was enormous. Gothic architecture with flying buttresses and a bell tower that DeAndre spotted immediately, pressing his face against the car window to study the structural details. "Mama, look at those buttresses," he breathed. "They're transferring the lateral thrust from the nave walls to the outer supports. That's why the walls can be so thin and tall." Margaret smiled despite the tension coiling in her chest. Her son's ability to find wonder in structural engineering even in the most emotionally charged moments was both endearing and useful. At least one member of their party would be distracted by architecture rather than drama. They parked. They walked toward the cathedral entrance. The air was warm and smelled like September, that particular mix of lingering summer heat and approaching autumn, the season of change, the time of year when everything that's been growing all summer finally reveals what it's become. Margaret could see other guests arriving, women in designer dresses and men in tailored suits, the Atlanta social class she'd once belonged to by marriage and had left by choice. She recognized some faces from a distance, people she'd made small talk with at Cox family events, people who'd attended the annual dinner where Mark had announced her supposed infertility to a garden full of bourbon drinkers, people who had pitied her, who had probably whispered about her after she left. Poor Margaret. Such a shame. She seemed like such a nice girl. Nice, as if niceness was the relevant characteristic, as if what had happened to her was about niceness rather than cruelty. Margaret straightened her spine, adjusted her grip on her children's hands, and walked toward the cathedral doors. The narthex was crowded with guests finding their way to seats. An usher approached Margaret with a program and a professional smile that flickered slightly when he noticed the children. "Name?" he asked. "Margaret Howard. We're seated in the 4th row. Patrick reserved our seats personally." The usher checked his list, found her name, and nodded. He didn't ask about the children. He didn't need to. Patrick had handled the details with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the most important things happen in the preparation, not the performance. They entered the nave, and everything slowed down. The cathedral was breathtaking. Soaring ceilings, Stained glass windows casting jeweled light across stone floors. Columns marching down both sides of the nave like sentinels, their capitals carved with leaves and flowers that had been holding their positions for over a century. DeAndre made a small sound of awe and immediately pulled out his notebook. "Corinthian capitals," he whispered to Margaret, with a canthus leaf detailing. "This is incredible." Under other circumstances, Margaret would have smiled, would have crouched beside him and shared the moment. But her eyes were already moving past the architecture to the front of the cathedral, where the wedding party was assembled. And there he was. Mark Cox stood to the right of the altar, hands clasped in front of him, wearing a tuxedo that fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his body. He was talking to the officiant, smiling, looking exactly like what he was. A wealthy, powerful, perfectly groomed man playing his role in a family ceremony, with the practiced ease of someone who'd been performing for audiences his entire life. He hadn't seen her yet. The cathedral was large enough that the entrance was 100 feet from the altar, and Mark's attention was focused on the officiant and the groomsmen beside him. Margaret had approximately 30 seconds before he looked up. She used them. She guided the twins down the side aisle toward the fourth row, not the center aisle. This wasn't her day. She wasn't here to create a spectacle. She was here to exist, openly, honestly, in a space where she'd been erased from the story. But 300 people were already turning to look. Not all of them, not yet, but enough. The ripples started at the back of the cathedral and moved forward like a wave, heads turning, whispers starting, the particular energy shift that happens when something unexpected enters a controlled environment. A woman Margaret vaguely recognized from the Cox family social circle turned in her pew and did a visible double-take. Her eyes went from Margaret's face to the twins and stayed there, widening with the slow dawning of recognition. "Is that?" the woman started to say to the man beside her. The whispers multiplied. They traveled through the pews like electricity through water, each person turning to confirm what the person behind them had just seen. Margaret. Mark's ex-wife Margaret. With children. Two children who looked like. Margaret reached the fourth row. She stepped into the pew. She settled DeAndre on her left and Deja on her right. She smoothed Deja's yellow dress. She opened DeAndre's notebook to a blank page and handed him his pencil. She folded her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead at the altar. And Mark looked up. The moment lasted 3 seconds and 3 years simultaneously. His eyes found hers first, and she watched recognition register. Margaret, here, in this cathedral, at his brother's wedding. His expression went through a rapid series of adjustments. Surprise, confusion, the beginnings of a polite social smile, the kind he'd deploy for any unexpected guest. Then his eyes dropped to the children. Margaret watched it happen. The exact moment Mark Cox's world restructured itself. His gaze moved from her face to DeAndre, sitting on her left with his notebook and pencil, sketching the column capitals with focused attention. Then to Deja, sitting on her right in her sunflower yellow dress, humming softly, swinging her legs because they didn't reach the floor. Then back to Margaret, then back to the children. She watched him count backward, watched the mathematics resolve behind his eyes, watched 5 years of carefully maintained fiction collide with the undeniable biological breathing truth sitting in the fourth row of his brother's wedding. His face went white, not pale, white, the color of a man watching the structural supports of his entire identity give way beneath him. He swayed slightly, and the groomsman beside him put a hand on his arm with a questioning look. Mark didn't respond to the touch. He was staring at the fourth row with an expression Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. It was the expression of a man seeing ghosts. Except these ghosts had his jawline and his eyes, and they were very much alive. "Mama," Deja whispered, tugging Margaret's hand. "Why is that man staring at us?" "Because we're beautiful," Margaret replied softly, "and because some of them are about to learn something important." "About what?" DeAndre asked, his pencil pausing over his sketch. "About telling the truth." The processional music began. The ceremony had to proceed. 300 guests were here for Patrick and Simone, not for the quiet detonation happening in Mark Cox's cardiovascular system. The bridesmaids entered. The flower girls scattered petals. The crowd rose for the bride. Simone Laurent walked down the aisle in a dress that looked like it was made of light, and she was beautiful, and Margaret was genuinely happy for Patrick. And none of that changed the fact that Mark Cox was standing at the altar, looking like a man who'd been shot but hadn't fallen yet. The ceremony was lovely. Patrick's vows were personal and specific and slightly funny in the way that genuine love often is. Simone's vows were fierce and tender and contained a line about choosing honesty over comfort that made Margaret's breath catch. The officiant spoke about commitment and truth and the courage required to build something real. Mark performed his duties on autopilot. He held the rings. He stood where he was supposed to stand. He smiled when photographs were taken, but his eyes kept drifting to the fourth row, with the gravitational pull of someone who has just discovered a new planet in his solar system and can't stop calculating its orbit. DeAndre sketched through the entire ceremony. He captured the altar, the stained glass, the column capitals, and, without anyone asking him to, a small sketch of the view from their pew. 2 rows of guests, an aisle of scattered petals, and at the far end, a group of men in tuxedos, one of whom was looking directly at the viewer. Deja watched the ceremony with the rapt attention of a child who loved spectacle. She whispered commentary to Margaret throughout. "Her dress is so pretty. Why is that lady crying? Is the man with the rings our uncle? Why does that tall man keep looking at us?" Margaret answered everything except the last question. To that one, she simply squeezed Deja's hand and said, "I'll explain later, baby." After the ceremony, the cathedral emptied slowly, guests flowing out into the September afternoon like water from a vessel. Margaret kept the twins close, moving with the crowd, neither rushing nor lingering. She'd planned to go directly to the reception, to let the Whisper Network do its work, to be present without being aggressive. But Mark found her in the narthex. He appeared at her elbow like a man who'd been fighting his way through the crowd for the last 5 minutes, which he probably had. His face was still white. A thin sheen of sweat had appeared at his temples, despite the cathedral's air conditioning. His hands, she noticed, were shaking. Margaret. Her name in his mouth. A sound she hadn't heard in 5 years. A sound she'd once loved and then learned to flinch from and had finally, she thought, become indifferent to. She was wrong about the indifference. Hearing him say her name in this cathedral, with her children at her sides, produced an emotional response she hadn't anticipated. Not love. Not anger. Something more like vertigo. The disorientation of 2 timelines colliding. "Mark," she replied. Her voice was steady. She'd practiced that steadiness for 2 weeks. Had stood in her bathroom in Charleston and said his name out loud until it no longer made her chest tighten. "I need to talk to you," he said. His eyes kept dropping to the twins and snapping back up to her face, as if looking at them directly was something he could only do in short bursts. "Please, I need to." "Not now," Margaret said calmly. "Your brother just got married. There's a reception to attend. We can talk there." "Margaret, those children. Are they?" He couldn't finish the sentence. His voice broke on the word children like a wave on rocks. "We'll talk at the reception," Margaret repeated. "This is Patrick's Day. Don't make it about you." The words landed like a slap. She watched him absorb them, watched the old Mark, the Mark who would have argued, who would have insisted, who would have reframed her boundaries as unreasonable, fight for control. But something had shifted. Whether it was the shock or some genuine growth, or simply the awareness that he was standing in a house of God having a conversation he hadn't prepared for, he stepped back. "Okay," he said. "The reception. Please don't leave before we talk." Margaret didn't promise anything. She guided the twins past him and out into the sunlight, where the September air felt like permission to breathe. The reception was held at the Biltmore, because of course it was. The Cox family operated on a scale that didn't include venues with less than 100-year history and fewer than 3 crystal chandeliers. Margaret had been to the Biltmore once before, during her marriage, for a Cox Capital Partners gala. She remembered the ballroom, the gilded ceiling, the particular way wealth echoed in large, beautiful rooms, making everything sound both more important and less real. They were seated at table 14, near the side of the room but not hidden. Patrick's doing, close enough to be present, far enough from the head table to avoid the appearance of confrontation. DeAndre immediately pulled out his notebook and began sketching the ballroom's architectural details. The coffered ceiling, the arched windows, the proportions of the columns, which he noted were Ionic rather than Corinthian. "Different from the cathedral," he told Margaret. "These are more restrained, more about balance than decoration." Deja was less interested in architecture and more interested in the cake, which she'd spotted across the room on a table draped in white. It was 5 tiers with real flowers cascading down the sides. "Mama," Deja breathed. "That cake has real flowers on it." "It does," Margaret agreed. Can I have some? In a little bit. They'll serve it after dinner. What if it runs out? It won't run out. There's enough cake for everyone. Deja did not appear convinced, but accepted this assurance with minimal protest, directing her attention instead to the flower girl, who was sitting 2 tables away. Within 5 minutes, Deja had crossed the room and introduced herself, and the 2 girls were engaged in an elaborate game involving dinner rolls and an imaginary dragon kingdom that apparently required complex diplomatic negotiations. Margaret let her go. Deja was social in the way that confident children are, approaching the world with the assumption that everyone she met was a potential friend rather than a potential threat. It was a quality Margaret had deliberately cultivated in her children, the opposite of the suspicion and guardedness that had defined her own adult life. The cocktail hour buzzed with the particular energy of a social event that had been disrupted by unexpected information. Margaret could feel the whisper network operating around her, conversations that stopped when she walked past, glances that lasted half a second too long, the careful repositioning of social alliances that happens when a community's shared understanding of reality is suddenly revealed to be incomplete. She didn't care. She'd stopped caring about the opinions of people who had believed Mark's lie without question, who had pitied her without verifying, who had accepted a man's narrative about his wife's body without ever thinking to ask the wife herself. Patrick found her during the cocktail hour, crossing the ballroom with the particular urgency of a groom on a mission. He looked handsome and slightly overwhelmed, and deeply, genuinely happy. "You came," he said, and his voice carried a warmth that Margaret felt in her chest. "I came." He looked at DeAndre, who was sketching at the table, then across the room at Deja, who was now conducting what appeared to be a peace treaty between the dinner roll kingdom and the flower girl's napkin nation. "They're incredible," Patrick said quietly. "They're so clearly yours," Margaret finished. "I know. DeAndre has his jawline. Deja has his smile. The irony isn't lost on me. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine." "How is Mark holding up?" Patrick's expression shifted. "He's in the men's room. He's been in there for 20 minutes. I sent a groomsman to check on him. Is he okay?" "I don't know. I don't think he knows. This is the first time I've seen my brother genuinely unable to control a situation, and I'll be honest, Margaret. Part of me thinks he deserves every second of discomfort. And part of me remembers he's my brother, and this is a lot to absorb." Margaret nodded. She understood the complexity of that position. Loving someone who'd done something terrible, wanting justice for the victim while still caring about the perpetrator. It was the same complexity she navigated every time DeAndre looked up at her with Mark's eyes. "Simone wants to meet you," Patrick continued. "She knows everything. I told her before the wedding. She says you're the bravest person she's ever heard of, and she wants to have you over for dinner once we're back from the honeymoon. I'd like that." Patrick squeezed her hand. "And, Margaret, whatever happens tonight with Mark, whatever he says or doesn't say, I want you to know that you and those children are welcome in my family, not his family. Mine. You always were, and I'm sorry I didn't fight harder to keep you in it." Margaret felt tears threaten and blinked them back. "You have nothing to apologize for, Patrick. You were the only one who called, the only one who treated me like a person instead of a problem. That meant more than you know." Patrick returned to his bride, and Margaret watched him go with the particular warmth reserved for people who restore your faith in an entire family by being the single, stubborn exception. Dinner was served. Margaret ate without tasting. DeAndre ate methodically, as he did everything, working through his plate with systematic efficiency. Deja returned from her diplomatic mission with the flower girl and ate 3 rolls before Margaret noticed and redirected her toward the actual meal. The speeches happened. The best man's speech happened. Mark stood before 300 people and spoke about his brother's love for Simone with words that were technically perfect and emotionally hollow. He told a funny story about their childhood. He made a toast. He smiled. But Margaret, who had spent 3 years married to this man, who knew the architecture of his face the way she knew the architecture of her ceramics, could see what the other guests couldn't. The hairline cracks running through his composure, the way his eyes kept finding the 4th row that was now table 14, the slight tremor in his hand as he raised his champagne glass. He was falling apart, slowly, elegantly, in the way that expensive things fall apart, but falling apart nonetheless. After the speeches, after the first dance, after the cutting of the cake that Deja had been monitoring with the vigilance of a security detail, Mark appeared at table 14. Margaret saw him coming. She had time to prepare, to settle her expression into something neutral and controlled, to take a breath that filled her lungs with enough oxygen to sustain whatever was about to happen. He arrived at the table and stood there for a moment, looking down at DeAndre's sketches, at Deja's abandoned dinner roll kingdom, at the evidence of two lives he hadn't known existed until 90 minutes ago. "Can we talk?" he asked. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual authority. The twins looked up, DeAndre with wary assessment, Deja with open curiosity. "Who are you?" Deja asked with the guileless directness of a child who hasn't learned to be afraid of asking. Mark made a sound like something inside him was fracturing along a line that had been stressed for years. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. He started. "He's someone I used to know," Margaret interjected gently. "Deja, why don't you go find your friend? I think she's over by the cake table." "Is there more cake?" Deja asked, immediately redirecting her attention to the only thing she considered more interesting than a stranger. "There might be. Take your brother." "I don't want to go," DeAndre said, his eyes fixed on Mark with an intensity that suggested he was conducting a structural assessment. "DeAndre," Margaret said, and her voice carried the particular note that meant this is not a negotiation. "Please take your sister to the cake table. I'll come find you in a few minutes." DeAndre hesitated. He looked at Mark. He looked at Margaret. Whatever calculation he was running behind those two perceptive eyes produced an answer he didn't like, but he stood up, took Deja's hand, and walked away with the visible reluctance of a child who knew he was missing something important. Once they were out of earshot, Mark sank into the chair DeAndre had vacated like his legs had been waiting for permission to stop working. "Those are my children," he said. The words came out flat, declarative. A man stating a fact he was still trying to absorb. Biologically, yes. In every other way, they're mine. I carried them. I delivered them. I fed them and bathed them and stayed up with them through fevers and nightmares and the entire terrifying first year when I didn't know if I was doing any of it right. I built their world from nothing. So yes, Mark, the DNA is yours. Everything else is mine." Mark pressed his palms against his eyes. The same gesture Margaret remembered from their marriage. His tell. The thing he did when emotion threatened to overwhelm the control he prized above everything. "How old are they?" 5. Their birthday is March 22nd. She watched him do the math, watched him count backward 9 months, watched the realization settle into his bones. "You were pregnant when you left," he said. "I found out 2 weeks after I left. At Gloria's apartment. I went to the doctor because I thought I was sick from grief. Turns out I was growing 2 humans. And you didn't tell me. No. 5 years, Margaret. 5 years. They've been alive for 5 years and I didn't know?" Margaret's voice hardened. "You're right. You didn't know. The same way you didn't know that telling your friends I was infertile was a lie. The same way you didn't know that sleeping with Vanessa for 18 months while holding my hand in fertility clinics was monstrous. The same way you didn't know that reducing my body to a punchline at a dinner party was the kind of cruelty that doesn't wash off." His hands dropped from his face. His eyes were red, not from crying, though that might come later, but from the particular strain of a man confronting himself for the first time. "I know," he said. "I know what I did. Do you? Because from where I sat, Mark, you spent our entire marriage performing devotion, performing desire for children, performing the role of devoted husband while carrying on an affair and telling anyone who'd listen that your wife was broken. So forgive me if I don't trust you or I know. You've been lying so long I'm not sure you can tell the difference anymore." The words were precise, surgical. Margaret had spent 5 years sharpening them, and they cut exactly as intended. Mark didn't defend himself. That was the first surprise. The Mark she'd been married to would have explained, reframed, redirected. This Mark sat in a chair at table 14 in his brother's wedding reception and took it. "You're right," he said, "about all of it. The lying, the affair, what I said about you on the terrace. I have no excuse. I have explanations, but they're not the same thing, and you deserve better than a man who explains away cruelty." Margaret stared at him. She hadn't expected this. She'd expected the old Mark, the one with an answer for everything, the one who could make black look white and wrong sound reasonable. This quiet, broken version of him was disorienting. "What do you want?" she asked. "From me, from this conversation. What do you want? To know their names." The simplicity of the request caught her off guard. Not custody, not DNA tests, not a negotiation about rights and access. Their names. The boy is DeAndre, she said. The girl is Deja. DeAndre and Deja, Mark repeated, and his voice broke on the second name in a way that he clearly hadn't intended and couldn't prevent. She's obsessed with dragons, Margaret said, and she wasn't sure why she was offering this information except that it seemed important. Everything has to be yellow. She argues about everything and sings songs about things that don't need songs, and she named her stuffed dragon Queenie, and she has your smile. Mark's composure shattered. He put his head in his hands and his shoulders shook, and Margaret watched a billionaire CEO cry at his brother's wedding and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not vindication, pity, the genuine, uncomplicated pity of watching another human being confront the full weight of what they've lost through their own choices. And DeAndre? Mark managed after a moment, his voice muffled by his hands. He's quiet, brilliant. He wants to be an architect. He draws buildings constantly, studies structural engineering, asks me about flying buttresses on the drive here. He has your eyes and your mind, and he approached this entire day like a research project. He's been sketching the cathedral's column capitals since we sat down. Mark lifted his head. Tears on his face, no attempt to hide them. He looked across the room to where DeAndre and Deja stood near the cake table, DeAndre pointing out something about the ballroom ceiling to his sister, while Deja ignored him entirely in favor of examining the remaining cake. They're perfect, Mark whispered. Yes, Margaret agreed. They are. I made sure of it. The double meaning wasn't lost on either of them. Margaret had made sure they were perfect by building their world without him, by protecting them from the kind of man she discovered he was, by choosing their well-being over his rights. Can the first, Mark started, then stopped, tried again. Can I know them? Margaret was quiet for a long time, long enough that the dance music started, long enough that she could see Deja beginning to sway to the rhythm, pulling DeAndre's arm, trying to get him to dance while he resisted with the dignified horror of a 5-year-old boy being asked to do something uncool. I didn't come here to negotiate custody, Margaret said finally. I came here because my children deserve to exist in the open, because I'm tired of carrying a secret that was never mine to carry, and because Patrick invited me, and he's the only member of your family who ever treated me like a human being. That's fair. It's not about fair, Mark. Fair would have been you telling the truth about our fertility struggles instead of lying about my body. Fair would have been fidelity. Fair would have been a marriage where I didn't have to find out about your affair from an open laptop. Fair left the building a long time ago. What we're dealing with now is reality. So what does reality look like? For them, for me, reality looks like this. They don't know who you are. Not yet. They know they have a father who isn't part of their life. They've asked questions, and I've answered honestly, without providing details they're not old enough to process. If, and I mean if, I decide to introduce the idea of you being in their lives, it will happen on my timeline, under my conditions, with their well-being as the only consideration. Of course, whatever you need, whatever terms you set. I don't need anything from you, Mark. That's what you need to understand. I built a life without you. A good life. A successful life. A life where my children are healthy and happy and loved. I don't need your money. I don't need your name. I don't need your connections or your resources or a single thing you have to offer. So when I say your involvement will happen on my terms, understand that those terms come from a position of strength, not need. The words settled over Mark like a sentence, which they were. Before either of them could speak again, a small voice interrupted from behind Margaret's chair. Mama, I saved you a piece of cake. It has a purple flower on it, so it's the best one. Deja stood there with a plate of cake, looking up at Margaret with an expression of absolute seriousness about the purple flower situation. Behind her, DeAndre lingered, his notebook open, his pencil moving absently, his eyes fixed on Mark with an expression Margaret recognized. Assessment, analysis, the same look he gave buildings before deciding whether their architecture was sound. Thank you, baby, Margaret said, taking the plate. That was very thoughtful. Is this man okay? Deja asked, peering at Mark's face with the frank curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she doesn't notice when someone's been crying. His eyes are red. He's fine, Margaret said gently. Sometimes adults have big feelings, and it shows on their faces. Like when you cried at my school play. DeAndre offered. You said it was because you were proud, but your eyes were red too. Exactly like that, Margaret agreed. Now come sit with me. It's getting late." The twins settled on either side of her. Deja ate her cake with focused dedication. DeAndre continued sketching, though Margaret noticed he'd started a new page. A drawing of the ballroom, but with 3 small figures at a table. 2 children and 1 woman. No one else. Mark watched all of this. He watched Deja eat cake. He watched DeAndre draw. He watched the easy, practiced intimacy between Margaret and her children, the small touches and quiet words and instinctive understanding that comes from 5 years of being a family of 3. And Margaret could see on his face the full scope of his loss settling in, not as an abstract concept, but as a specific, detailed, irreversible reality. These children took their first steps, and he wasn't there. They said their first words, and he wasn't there. They had birthdays and holidays and first days of school and nightmares and fevers and triumphs and failures, and he wasn't there for any of it. Not because Margaret had stolen them from him, though he might try to frame it that way later, but because he had created conditions so toxic, so dishonest, so fundamentally unsafe, that the mother of his children had determined that his absence was preferable to his presence. That was the truth. And tonight, in this ballroom, surrounded by every person who had ever believed his version of events, the truth was sitting at table 14 eating cake with a purple flower on it. "I should go," Mark said quietly. "This is a lot. For everyone." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "It is." He stood. He looked at the twins one more time, then at Margaret. "Can I call you? Not now, but this week, when I've had time to process." "You can call," Margaret said. "But Mark, if I answer, it doesn't mean I've decided anything. It means I'm willing to have a conversation. That's all." "That's enough," he said. "That's more than I deserve." "You're right," Margaret replied. "It is." He walked away. Margaret watched him navigate through the reception, stopping to shake hands and smile at guests with the muscle memory of a man who'd been performing at social events his entire life. But his performance was off tonight. The smile didn't reach his eyes. The handshakes lasted half a beat too long or ended half a beat too early. He was a machine operating on backup power, functional but clearly impaired. Patricia Cox found Margaret 15 minutes later. Mark's mother moved through the reception with the particular grace of a woman who had been hosting and attending social events since before Margaret was born. She wore pearls. She always wore pearls. They were her uniform, her identity marker, her way of telling the world that she was a Cox, and Coxes had standards. She stopped at table 14 and looked down at DeAndre and Deja with an expression Margaret couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't shock. Patricia was too controlled for shock. It was something closer to recognition. The dawning awareness of looking at faces that carried echoes of faces she'd known her entire life. "Margaret," Patricia said. Her voice was modulated. Careful, the voice of a woman who was choosing every word with surgical precision. "Patricia, these children are your grandchildren." Margaret kept her voice steady. "DeAndre and Deja, they're 5 years old. They've been alive since 9 months after I left your son's house with 2 suitcases and a note on the kitchen counter." Patricia's composure flickered. A crack in the porcelain, barely visible but unmistakable. "I didn't know," Patricia said. "No," Margaret agreed. "You didn't, because your son told everyone, including I'm guessing you, that I couldn't have children, that my body had failed, that he was the noble husband carrying the burden of a broken wife. And you believed him. Everyone believed him. Because why would a man like Mark Cox lie about something like that?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with 5 years of answer. Patricia looked at DeAndre, who was watching this exchange with the still attention of a child who understood that adults were discussing things above his pay grade, but intended to absorb as much data as possible for later analysis. She looked at Deja, who was licking frosting off her fingers and humming a song about a dragon who lived on a cake. "They look like David," Patricia said, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. "The boy has David's forehead. The girl has Mark's smile," Margaret finished. "I know." Patricia sat down. She didn't ask permission. She simply lowered herself into a chair with the controlled descent of a woman whose legs had decided they were done supporting the weight of this particular revelation. "I should have called you," Patricia said. "After the divorce. I should have reached out." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "You should have. I let my son's narrative become my understanding of your marriage. I accepted his version without questioning it. That was a failure on my part." Margaret studied Mark's mother. She'd never liked Patricia, had found her cold, controlling, more interested in the Cox family brand than in the actual humans who comprised it. But sitting here now, watching this woman confront the gap between the story she'd been told and the truth she was now seeing, Margaret felt something shift. "You're right," Margaret said. "It was a failure. But it wasn't just yours. Everyone in your social circle accepted Mark's version without question. Nobody asked me. Nobody called to check. I became a character in his story, and the whole world went along with the plot." "Can the first," Patricia started, then stopped, her composure cracking further. "Can I hold their hands?" It was such a strange request, so specific. Not can I hug them or can I talk to them, but can I hold their hands? As if Patricia understood instinctively that the first connection between a grandmother and the grandchildren she'd been denied had to begin with something small, something gentle, something that asked for contact without overwhelming. Margaret looked at the twins. "DeAndre, you and Deja, this is Patricia. She's your father's mother, your grandmother." DeAndre's pencil stopped moving. He looked at Patricia with that assessing gaze that missed nothing. "I have a grandmother?" Deja asked, her frosting-covered fingers pausing midway to her mouth. "You have two," Margaret said. "You know Mama's mother, Grandma Cecilia, in Savannah. Patricia is your other grandmother." Deja looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at Deja. Two strangers connected by blood and separated by lies, meeting for the first time across a table at a wedding reception. "Do you like dragons?" Deja asked, because Deja evaluated all relationships through this essential filter. "I don't know much about dragons," Patricia admitted, "but I'd very much like to learn." Deja considered this answer, found it acceptable, extended her frosting-covered hand. Patricia took it and held it, and Margaret watched Mark Cox's mother hold her granddaughter's hand for the first time and understood that this moment, whatever it cost, whatever complications it created, was right. These children deserved to know where they came from, all of it, the good parts and the broken parts and the parts that were still being decided. The reception wound down. The cake was consumed. The dancing continued, but with decreasing energy as the evening grew late. Margaret began gathering the twins, who were fading the way children fade, suddenly and completely, like batteries reaching zero. Deja was asleep against Margaret's shoulder, one hand still clutching a dinner roll she'd smuggled from the table. DeAndre was yawning over his notebook, his sketches becoming increasingly abstract as exhaustion overtook precision. Mark appeared one final time as Margaret was heading toward the exit. He stood near the coat check, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had aged 5 years in 5 hours. "Please don't leave without letting me say one thing," he said. Margaret shifted Deja's weight on her hip. She was tired, emotionally, physically, down to her bones tired. But she stopped. "Go ahead." "I was wrong," Mark said, "about everything. The things I said about you, what I did to our marriage, the lie about your body, every word of it was wrong. And not wrong like a mistake. Wrong like a choice. I chose to lie because lying was easier than facing the truth about myself. I chose to have an affair because commitment was harder than escape. I chose to blame you for our fertility struggles because the alternative was admitting that maybe I was the problem. Maybe my inability to be honest, to be present, to be a real partner, maybe that was what was broken. Not your body. Me." Margaret stared at him. DeAndre had stopped walking and was listening with his entire body, notebook forgotten in his hand. "I don't expect forgiveness," Mark continued. "I don't expect a chance. I just need you to hear me say, out loud, in front of anyone who's listening, that Margaret Howard was never broken. She was never defective. She was never the failure I made her out to be. She was a woman I didn't deserve, married to a man who wasn't worthy of her, and I will spend the rest of my life knowing that the best thing that ever happened to me walked out the door because I was too much of a coward to be the man she needed." The coat check attendant was staring. 2 guests lingering nearby had stopped their conversation. DeAndre was looking up at Mark with an expression Margaret couldn't read. She let the words settle. Let them exist in the air alongside 5 years of pain, and 5 years of survival, and 5 years of building a life that proved everything Mark had said about her was wrong. "Okay," Margaret said. Not, "thank you." Not, "I forgive you." Okay. The simplest acknowledgement. The smallest possible door left open. Then she carried Deja into the September night, DeAndre walking beside her, and they left the Biltmore behind. The drive back to the hotel was quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a family has been through something enormous and needs time to let it settle. Deja was asleep. DeAndre was awake, watching the city lights pass the car window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. "Mama?" he said after 10 minutes of silence. Yes, baby. That man at the wedding. The one who was crying. He's our father, isn't he? Margaret gripped the steering wheel. What makes you think that? DeAndre was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts the way he organized his drawings. Precisely. He looked at us like he recognized us, DeAndre said, like looking in a mirror and seeing someone else's face. And when you told the grandmother lady who we were, she looked at me the way Grandma Cecilia looks at you, like she was seeing someone she already knew. Margaret's throat tightened. Her son's perceptiveness was a gift she hadn't fully appreciated until this moment. He saw structures that other people missed, not just in buildings, in people, in the architecture of relationships and the load-bearing walls of truth. Yes, Margaret said. He's your father. Is he nice? I don't know yet. I knew him a long time ago, and he wasn't very kind then. But people can change. Sometimes. Why wasn't he kind? Margaret considered how much truth a 5-year-old could hold. She decided on enough. He told lies about me. To other people. Lies that hurt me. And he did things that broke my trust in him. I left because staying wasn't safe for my heart. And when I found out I was pregnant with you and Deja, I decided to raise you myself, rather than let someone who'd been dishonest into your lives. DeAndre processed this. His pencil tapped against his notebook in a rhythm that Margaret recognized as his thinking pattern. But you let him see us today, DeAndre said. I did. Does that mean you think he's changed? It means I think you and Deja deserve to decide for yourselves. When you're ready. On your terms. DeAndre nodded slowly. Then he opened his notebook to the sketch he'd made at the reception. The one with 3 figures at a table, 2 children, and 1 woman. He picked up his pencil and, after a long hesitation, added a 4th figure, standing slightly apart. Watching. I drew him, DeAndre said simply. He's not at the table yet, but he's in the picture. Margaret looked at her son's drawing in the rearview mirror and felt something crack inside her chest. Not break. Crack. The way ice does when spring comes, making room for something new to emerge. He's in the picture, she repeated softly. Yes, I suppose he is. At the hotel, Margaret carried Deja to bed and tucked her in, removing the dinner roll from her grip with the practiced stealth of a mother who'd been confiscating inappropriate bedtime items for 5 years. She tucked DeAndre in next, his notebook on the nightstand, his pencil lined up precisely beside it. Mama, DeAndre said as she kissed his forehead. Yes, baby. Do you think you'll ever let him sit at the table? I don't know, Margaret answered honestly, but I'm thinking about it. Good, DeAndre said, because the picture looks better with 4 people in it. Margaret turned off the light and stood in the doorway, watching her children sleep. These 2 humans she'd built and raised and protected, who somehow combined the best parts of her and the best parts of a man who hadn't deserved them, who were, despite everything, exactly who they were supposed to be. Now I need to pause one more time. Because this moment, a mother standing in a doorway watching her children sleep on the night their entire world shifted, this is the moment the real question emerges. Not whether Mark Cox deserves a second chance, not whether he's genuinely changed or just performing a new version of the same old act. The real question is about Margaret, about whether the walls she built to protect herself and her children have served their purpose and can now be examined, or whether those walls have become permanent, necessary, the only thing standing between her and the kind of vulnerability that almost destroyed her once before. I need you to think about that. Think about the walls in your own life, the ones you built after someone hurt you. Are they still protecting you? Or have they become the thing that keeps you from the life you actually want? Drop a comment right now telling me what you think Margaret should do. Should she let Mark in? Should she maintain the boundaries that kept her safe for 5 years? Should she give her children's father a chance to prove he's changed? Or should she trust the lesson she learned on that terrace and keep him at a distance forever? Your voice matters in this community. Every comment, every like, every share builds something here at Mr. Dawson Stories. Something real, something honest, something that says, we believe in the messy, complicated, painful, beautiful truth of human stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Turn on notifications. Because what happens next, how Margaret navigates the impossible territory between self-protection and possibility, between justice and grace, between the mother she is and the woman she might become. That's a journey you won't want to miss. Now let me tell you what happened after that night. Margaret's phone lit up on the hotel nightstand at 11:47 that evening. She was lying in bed, not sleeping, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events with the kind of obsessive detail that her brain produced when her body was too tired to override it. The text was from Mark. "I'm sorry. For everything. I know that's not enough, but I need you to know I see what I did and I'll spend the rest of my life regretting it. They're extraordinary, Margaret. You raised extraordinary children. Whatever happens next, whatever you decide, thank you for that." Margaret stared at the message for a long time. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. She typed and deleted 3 responses. The first was too kind. The second was too harsh. The third was too long. She settled on the truth. "Don't text me tonight. Process what you're feeling. If you still want to talk in a week, call me. Not text. Call. And Mark, if you call, come with honesty. Not performance. Not strategy. Not the version of yourself you think I want to hear. Come with the truth, even if it's ugly. Especially if it's ugly. I've had enough beautiful lies to last a lifetime." She sent it, set the phone face down on the nightstand, and lay in the dark listening to her children breathe. Sleep didn't come for a long time. When it finally arrived, Margaret dreamed of buildings. Tall ones, strong ones, buildings that DeAndre would love, with flying buttresses and load-bearing walls and foundations sunk so deep into the earth that nothing could shake them. And somewhere in the dream, one of the buildings had a door that had been sealed for 5 years. And someone was knocking. She didn't open it. Not yet. But she noticed for the first time that her hand was reaching for the handle. The week that followed the wedding was the longest of Margaret's life. Longer than the week she'd left Mark. Longer than the week she discovered she was pregnant. Longer than the first week home from the hospital with 2 newborns and no idea whether she was capable of keeping them alive. Because those weeks had been about survival, and Margaret knew how to survive. She was built for it, trained for it. Her entire adult life had been an education in enduring the unsurvivable and emerging with something worth keeping. This week was about something different. This week was about deciding. She went back to Charleston, back to the small house near the water that had become her fortress, back to the studio where her hands could work through what her mind couldn't process, back to the rhythm that had kept her sane for 5 years. School runs at 7:45, studio by 8:30, pick up at 3:15, homework, dinner, baths, books, bed, the ordinary architecture of a life she'd designed to be unshakable. But the foundation had shifted. She could feel it beneath every routine moment, a subtle vibration, like a building absorbing the aftershock of an earthquake that hasn't finished deciding how much damage it wants to do. The twins felt it too. Children always do. They sense disruption the way animals sense weather, instinctively, before the adults around them have finished pretending everything is fine. DeAndre was quieter than usual, which was saying something for a child who already operated at a volume most people would describe as contemplative. He sketched constantly, but his drawings had changed. Before the wedding, he drew buildings, clean, precise, architectural studies of structures that fascinated him. After the wedding, he started drawing people, small figures standing near buildings, figures that looked like they were waiting for permission to go inside. Margaret noticed. She didn't comment. She'd learned that DeAndre processed internally, that pushing him to talk before he was ready produced the opposite of openness. He'd come to her when his thoughts had organized themselves into something he could articulate. He always did. Deja was the opposite. Deja processed externally, loudly, with the full force of her personality, directed at whoever happened to be nearest. "Why didn't our dad come find us before?" Deja asked on Monday evening, while Margaret braided her hair for bed. "He didn't know about you," Margaret said carefully. "I didn't tell him." "Why not?" "Because when I left, I was hurt and scared, and I needed to protect you." "From what?" "From uncertainty," Margaret said. "From a man I wasn't sure would be a good father. From the possibility that he might let you down." "But you don't know if he would have let us down," Deja pointed out with the devastating logic of a 5-year-old who hadn't yet learned to accept adult rationalizations without examination. "You decided without asking him." Margaret's hands paused in Deja's hair. The observation landed with precision, finding the exact spot where Margaret's confidence in her decision was thinnest. "You're right," Margaret admitted. "I made a choice based on what I knew at the time. And what I knew was that he'd been dishonest with me about important things. I didn't trust him to be honest with you. Do you trust him now?" "I don't know yet, baby. That's what I'm trying to figure out." Deja was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough to be notable. "I think you should let him try," Deja said finally, "because Queenie says everyone deserves a chance to be brave." Margaret smiled despite the ache in her chest. "Oh, Queenie says that, does she?" "Queenie is very wise," Deja confirmed. "She's a dragon. Dragons know things." By Wednesday, Margaret had received no call from Mark. She'd told him to wait a week, and he was waiting. She wasn't sure if this demonstrated patience or strategy, and the fact that she couldn't tell the difference was itself telling. With the old Mark, everything had been strategy. Every gesture calculated. Every word chosen for maximum impact. She'd mistaken it for attentiveness, for care, for the kind of devotion that pays attention to details because the details matter. But it wasn't that. It was performance. The meticulous, comprehensive performance of a man who understood that people are most easily controlled when they feel most seen. Was this Mark different? Had 5 years and a shock at his brother's wedding genuinely changed something fundamental in him? Or was this just a new performance, adapted for new circumstances, the same manipulation in different packaging? Margaret didn't know. And the not knowing was worse than either answer. On Thursday evening, she called Gloria. "He hasn't called yet," Margaret said without preamble. "You told him to wait a week," Gloria replied. "It's Thursday. I know what day it is." "Then what's the problem?" "The problem is I don't know what I want him to do. Part of me wants him to call early because it would mean he can't wait, that knowing about the twins is so important he can't stick to a timeline. And part of me wants him to wait because it would mean he respects my boundaries. And I'm sitting here analyzing both possibilities instead of living my life, and I hate it. I hate that he has this power again. I hate that a man who already took so much from me is taking up space in my head." Gloria was quiet for a moment. "Margaret, he's not taking up space. You're giving it to him. There's a difference." The words stung because they were true. "So what do I do?" Margaret asked, and she hated the question, hated the sound of it in her own mouth, hated being a woman who asked what to do when she'd spent 5 years knowing exactly what to do at every moment. "You do what you've always done," Gloria said. "You make the best decision you can with the information you have, and then you live with it. You don't need me to tell you that. You don't need anyone to tell you that. You just need to trust yourself the way you did when you packed those suitcases and drove to my apartment with nothing. What if I'm wrong? Then you'll handle being wrong the way you handle everything, with your hands in clay and your children at your side and your spine straight. Margaret, you survived the worst thing that man could do to you. Whatever happens next is just weather." Margaret laughed. A real laugh, tired and thin but genuine. "When did you get so wise?" "I was born wise," Gloria said. "You just never listen." Friday, Margaret was in her studio, working. The piece under her hands was a vessel, large, meant to be a centerpiece, the kind of piece that would anchor a table and command attention. But it wasn't cooperating. The walls kept collapsing. She'd build them up, find the shape she was looking for, and then something in the structure would give way, and the whole thing would fold inward like a building with a compromised foundation. She knew what the problem was. Her hands were translating what her mind refused to articulate. She was building something that couldn't support its own weight because she was trying to control every element of its construction instead of letting the clay tell her what it wanted to become. Control, her greatest strength, her deepest flaw, the thing that had saved her and the thing that might be suffocating her. She sat back from the wheel and stared at the collapsed vessel. Clay slumped over itself like a structure that had given up. And she made a decision. She would let Mark into the twins' lives. Not fully, not immediately, not without conditions and boundaries and the kind of structural safeguards that would make her feel like she wasn't free-falling. But she would open the door, because DeAndre was drawing people who wanted to go inside buildings but couldn't, because Deja's stuffed dragon had more wisdom about second chances than Margaret did, because Patricia Cox had held her granddaughter's frosting-covered hand and cried, because Patrick had built his wedding on honesty, because 5 years was long enough to protect and maybe too long to hide, and because Margaret was tired, not of being strong. She would never be tired of being strong, but tired of being strong alone, tired of carrying a truth that had grown heavier with every year, tired of watching her children's faces for the questions they were learning not to ask because they sensed the answers would cost their mother something. She picked up the clay, started again, but this time she didn't try to control the walls. She let them find their own thickness, their own curve, their own relationship with gravity. The vessel that emerged was imperfect, asymmetrical, one side slightly thinner than the other, creating a gentle lean, like something reaching toward a source of light. She fired it. When it came out of the kiln, the thin side had developed a hairline crack. Margaret looked at it for a long time, then went to her supply cabinet and pulled out the gold lacquer she kept for kintsugi work. She sealed the crack with gold. The finished piece was beautiful in a way that perfection never could have been. Beautiful because it had broken. Beautiful because someone had chosen to repair it rather than discard it. Beautiful because the repair was visible, not hidden, an acknowledgement that damage was part of the story rather than something to be ashamed of. She called it beginning. Mark called on Saturday, exactly 1 week after the wedding. To the hour, Margaret was sitting on her back porch, watching the twins play in the yard. DeAndre was building something with sticks and rocks, an elaborate structure that appeared to involve multiple levels and a bridge connecting 2 sections. Deja was narrating an adventure for Queenie that involved a volcano, a peace treaty, and a castle made of cake. Margaret's phone rang. She looked at the screen. Mark Cox. She let it ring 3 times. Then she answered. "Margaret," Mark said. His voice was careful, measured. The voice of a man who had rehearsed this call and was now trying to sound unrehearsed. "Mark, thank you for answering. You said you'd call. You called. I told you I'd answer if you came with honesty. So come with honesty." A pause. She could hear him breathing. Could hear in the background the particular silence of a room occupied by one person who is trying very hard to find the right words. "I've been in therapy," Mark said. "Not since the wedding, since about 3 years ago. After Victoria, after everything fell apart and I was sitting in my apartment in Buckhead at 2 in the morning, wondering how I'd become someone I didn't recognize." Margaret said nothing. She let the silence do its work. "My therapist's name is Dr. Whitfield," Mark continued. "She's not impressed by me. She doesn't care about my net worth or my company or the Cox family name. She cares about the truth, and she spent 3 years dismantling every lie I've ever told myself about who I am and why I do what I do." Margaret watched DeAndre add a cantilever to his stick structure. The engineering was surprisingly sound. "What did you learn?" Margaret asked. "I learned that I'm terrified of vulnerability," Mark said. "That my entire life has been constructed to avoid it. The company, the control, the performance. All of it was designed to make sure nobody ever saw the parts of me I was ashamed of. And when you came along, when you challenged me to be real, to be honest, to actually show up as a whole human being instead of a curated version of one, I panicked. Not immediately, slowly, over time, because being known by you meant being seen by you, and being seen meant you might see the things I was hiding." "What were you hiding?" "Fear," Mark said simply. "Fear that I wasn't enough, that without the money and the name and the performance, there was nothing underneath worth keeping. That if you saw the real me, the scared, inadequate, deeply flawed version of me, you'd leave. So I pushed you away before you could. I found someone who didn't challenge me, who let me stay on the surface, who never asked me to be anything more than what I appeared to be." "Victoria," Margaret said. The name tasted like ash in her mouth even after 5 years. "Victoria," Mark confirmed. "She was easy. Not easy in the way people usually mean when they say that about a woman. Easy in the way that lies are easy. She didn't require honesty. She didn't demand growth. She let me be exactly who I already was, and at the time, I thought that was what I wanted. And now I understand that what I wanted was exactly what was killing me. A life without challenge is a life without growth. Victoria and I lasted 2 years after you left, and every day of those 2 years I felt myself getting smaller, more hollow, more like the person I was performing rather than the person I actually was. We ended because there was nothing to sustain. You can't build a relationship on the mutual agreement to never be real." Margaret listened. She listened with the trained ear of a woman who had spent 3 years married to this man's performances and had learned to detect the difference between what he said and what he meant. And here, now, on this phone call, she heard something she hadn't expected. She heard real, not polished, not strategic, not the carefully crafted narrative of a man managing his image. This was rough and uncomfortable, and full of the kind of specific detail that liars don't include, because liars deal in generalities. Liars say I've changed. Honest people say I've been in therapy for 3 years and my therapist isn't impressed by me. And the lie about my body? Margaret said. She needed to hear him address this directly, not as an aside, not as part of a larger confession. This specific wound, this particular betrayal. That, Mark said, and his voice dropped, heavy with something Margaret recognized as genuine shame. That was the worst thing I've ever done. And I need you to understand exactly what happened in my mind when I did it, not as an excuse, but as an explanation of the kind of cowardice I'm capable of. Go ahead. The fertility journey was hard. You know that. You lived it. But what you didn't know was how it was affecting me internally. Every appointment, every test, every month that passed without success, I felt like I was failing. Not we were failing. I was failing. Because in my family, Margaret, legacy is everything. My father built an empire. My job was to produce the next generation to inherit it. And when that didn't happen on schedule, when the doctors started using words like unexplained and patience required, I felt the walls closing in. Margaret's jaw tightened. She could feel where this was going. And instead of being honest about that fear, Mark continued, instead of telling you I was scared, instead of admitting that I felt inadequate and terrified of disappointing my family, I did what I've always done. I found someone else to blame. I took our shared struggle and made it your individual failure, because if it was your fault, it wasn't mine. If something was wrong with you, then nothing was wrong with me. I could be the sympathetic husband rather than the failing son. You told them at the dinner party, Margaret said. In the garden, while I stood on the terrace above you. I know. And I need you to know that I remember exactly what I said. I've replayed it in therapy more times than I can count. Margaret can't have children. Her body won't cooperate. I said those words, Margaret. I chose those words. I made a deliberate decision to publicly declare your body defective to protect my ego, and I did it to an audience I knew would spread it through our entire social circle within a week. Margaret's hand was gripping the phone so hard her knuckles were white. She forced herself to loosen her fingers. Why are you telling me this? She asked. What do you want from this conversation? I want you to know that I see it. All of it. Not just the affair, not just the lying, but the specific architecture of cruelty I built. Dr. Whitfield calls it blame transfer. I call it cowardice. And I need you to know that the man who did those things isn't the man I want to be. He's not the man I've been working to become for 3 years. And he's not the man I want my children to know. Our children, Margaret corrected quietly. Our children, Mark repeated. Our children who exist because your body, the body I publicly called broken, did exactly what it was designed to do. The irony of that isn't lost on me, Margaret. Every day for 3 years, I've looked in the mirror and known that I declared the woman I married infertile, and she responded by producing 2 perfect human beings without any help from me. DeAndre's stick structure collapsed. He studied the wreckage with calm assessment, identified the failure point, and began rebuilding. Margaret watched him and thought about foundations, about what holds and what gives way, about the difference between structures that look strong and structures that actually are. I want to know them, Mark said. I know I don't have the right to ask. I know I haven't earned anything. But I'm asking anyway, because they're my children, and I missed 5 years of their lives, and every day that passes is another day I'll never get back. Margaret was quiet for a long time, long enough that she heard Mark shift on the other end of the line, heard the creak of whatever chair he was sitting in, heard his breathing change from controlled to anxious as the silence stretched. Here's what's going to happen, Margaret said finally. You're going to fly to Charleston. Not this weekend, next weekend. You're going to meet me at Waterfront Park at 10 in the morning. You will not bring gifts. You will not make promises to the children about future visits. You will not use this meeting to negotiate custody or access or anything beyond this single interaction. Okay, Mark said immediately. I will be present the entire time. This is not a drop-off. This is supervised contact. I will watch every interaction, and if at any point I determine that the situation is not in the twins' best interest, we leave. No arguments, no negotiation. My decision is final. Of course, whatever you need. And Margaret's voice dropped to the register she reserved for the most important things she ever said. If you come to Charleston and perform for my children the way you performed for me during our marriage, I will know. I will see it. And that will be the end. Not a setback, not a pause. The end. These children have been raised on honesty. They can smell pretense from 100 yards. If you show up as anything other than who you actually are, They will know and I will know and you will never get another chance. I understand, Mark said. I'll be there. Real. Honest. Whatever that looks like. It looks messy, Margaret said. It looks imperfect and uncomfortable and nothing like a boardroom. It looks like a man sitting on a park bench not knowing what to say to a 5-year-old and figuring it out in real time. That's what real looks like. Then that's what I'll be. Margaret hung up. She set the phone on the porch railing and watched her children play. DeAndre had rebuilt his structure, stronger this time, with a wider base and more support points. Deja was crowning Queenie the ruler of the backyard kingdom, a ceremony that involved singing and dancing and the solemn placement of a dandelion crown on the dragon's stuffed head. These two extraordinary, resilient, brilliant humans she'd made and raised and protected. They deserved more than protection. They deserved completeness. And completeness, Margaret was beginning to understand, might require letting someone in who she'd spent 5 years keeping out. She told the twins on Wednesday evening. After dinner, after homework, after the routine that made everything feel stable and safe. Do you remember the man from the wedding? Margaret asked. They were sitting on the couch, the twins on either side of her, Deja's head on her shoulder, and DeAndre's notebook open on his lap. The one who was crying, Deja said. Our father, DeAndre added, with the matter-of-fact precision of a child who had already processed this information and filed it. Yes, Margaret said. He'd like to come to Charleston next weekend, to meet you properly, to spend some time together. Deja lifted her head from Margaret's shoulder. Will he bring Queenie a present? I told him not to bring gifts. Why? Deja looked personally offended by this policy. Because I want you to get to know him as a person, not as someone who buys things. Things are easy. Knowing someone is hard. We're going to do the hard thing. DeAndre closed his notebook. Mama, he said carefully, do you want us to like him? Margaret's heart cracked at the question, at the implication beneath it, that her son was prepared to not like his father if that was what Margaret needed, that this 5-year-old had read the emotional landscape of their family and determined that his mother's well-being might require him to reject the man who'd hurt her. I want you to be yourself, Margaret said. I want you to ask him whatever questions you have. I want you to pay attention to how he makes you feel. And then I want you to tell me the truth about what you think. Not what you think I want to hear. The actual truth. Can you do that? I can always do that, DeAndre said. The truth is my default setting. Margaret kissed the top of his head. Yes, it is. You got that from me. I got my architecture from him, DeAndre said quietly. Didn't I? Margaret paused. She'd never told DeAndre about Mark's background in structural engineering, had never mentioned the connection between her son's passion and his father's education. What makes you say that? Because at the wedding, when I was drawing the columns, he looked at my notebook from across the room. Most adults look at my drawings and say, nice picture. He looked at them the way I look at buildings, like he was reading them, like he understood what they meant. Margaret felt the familiar ache of watching her son be extraordinary in ways that had nothing to do with her. Yes, she said. He studied structural engineering in college, before he went into business. DeAndre absorbed this. Then he opened his notebook, flipped past the wedding sketches and the stick structures and the drawings of people standing outside buildings and started a new page. He drew a bridge, 2 sides reaching toward each other from opposite banks not yet connected, the span between them empty but measured. For next Saturday, he said. I want to show him this. Saturday arrived with the kind of cloudless autumn sky that Charleston does better than almost anywhere. Blue and endless and warm enough to sit outside without a jacket, but cool enough to make sitting outside feel like a choice rather than an obligation. Margaret dressed the twins in comfortable clothes. No fancy outfits. No performance. Jeans and sneakers and DeAndre's favorite shirt with the blueprint pattern and Deja's yellow cardigan, because everything important required yellow. She drove to Waterfront Park and parked where she could see the entrance. It was 9:45. Mark wasn't there yet. At 9:52, a rental car pulled into the lot. A black sedan, unremarkable. The kind of car a billionaire rents when he's trying not to look like a billionaire. Mark stepped out wearing jeans and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, an outfit so deliberately casual that it practically announced I overthought this. He stood by his car for a moment, looking at the park entrance. His hands went to his pockets, came out, went back in. He checked his phone, put it away, checked it again. He was nervous, genuinely, visibly, almost comically nervous. A man who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals and addressed shareholders and commanded boardrooms was standing in a parking lot terrified of 2 5-year-olds. Good, Margaret thought. He should be terrified. This was important enough to be terrified of. She got out of the car. The twins followed. DeAndre with his notebook, Deja with Queenie, because all significant life events required Queenie's presence. Mark saw them from across the lot. His face did the thing it had done at the wedding, that rapid collapse and reconstruction of composure, the visible effort of a man trying to contain emotion that was bigger than his ability to manage it. But this time, after the initial shock, something else emerged. A smile, not his boardroom smile, the one Margaret had seen 1,000 times at events and dinners and presentations. A different smile, uncertain, hopeful, young. He walked toward them, stopped at a distance that said, "I'm here, but I'm not going to invade your space." Margaret noticed the restraint. It was the right choice. "Hi," Mark said. He was looking at the twins with an expression that Margaret could only describe as hungry. The hunger of someone who's been starving and is finally seeing food, but is afraid to reach for it because it might not be real. "Hi," Deja replied immediately, because Deja had never met a silence she didn't want to fill. "I'm Deja. This is Queenie. She's a dragon. She's in charge." Mark's uncertain smile widened. "Hi, Deja." "Hi, Queenie. It's nice to meet you both." "Queenie says hi," Deja replied. "She also says she's watching you." Margaret pressed her lips together to suppress a smile. Her daughter, channeling maternal protectiveness through a stuffed dragon, was simultaneously the funniest and most appropriate thing she'd ever witnessed. DeAndre stood slightly behind Margaret, his notebook held against his chest like a shield. He was watching Mark with a focused assessment that Margaret recognized as his evaluation mode, taking in data, processing, withholding judgment until sufficient evidence had been collected. "Hello, DeAndre," Mark said. He crouched down to eye level, not because someone had told him to, but because some instinct told him that talking down to this particular child would be a mistake. "Your mom tells me you're interested in architecture." "I am," DeAndre confirmed. His voice was neutral, offering nothing beyond the fact. "I studied structural engineering in college," Mark said. "Before I went into business, I loved it. Sometimes I wish I'd stayed with it." "Why didn't you?" "Because my family expected me to run the company, and I chose their expectations over my own interests. That was a mistake." DeAndre processed this. Then, making a decision that Margaret could see forming behind his eyes, he opened his notebook and held it out. "I drew this," he said. "It's a bridge, 2 sides reaching toward each other. The span isn't complete yet because I haven't figured out the right structure for the middle section. The distance is too far for a simple beam, but I don't want to use cables because cables look like someone gave up on finding a real solution." Mark took the notebook with the reverence of someone being handed something sacred. He studied the drawing for a long time, not a polite glance. A real examination. His eyes moved across the page with the kind of attention Margaret recognized from the gallery, from the night he'd stood in front of her bowl and seen what other people missed. "This is remarkable," Mark said, and he meant it. Margaret could hear the difference between his performance voice and his real voice, and this was real. "The proportions are excellent. You have a natural understanding of scale. But the middle section," DeAndre pressed. "How do I connect them?" Mark sat down on the ground. Just sat down, right there in the grass near the parking lot, in his jeans and his rolled-up sleeves, and gestured for DeAndre to sit beside him. "There are several options," Mark said. "You could use an arch. Arches are one of the strongest structural forms in architecture. They distribute weight outward along the curve, which means the structure supports itself. Or you could use a truss system, which is essentially a series of triangles. Triangles are inherently stable because they can't be deformed without changing the length of one of their sides." DeAndre sat down beside his father, and just like that, as simply and naturally as 2 rivers finding the same valley, they were talking, really talking. Not the careful, measured conversation of strangers, but the excited, layered exchange of 2 people who speak the same language and have just discovered each other. Margaret watched from 3 feet away, standing with Deja, who was observing her brother's enthusiasm with the amused tolerance of a sibling who had long accepted that buildings would always be DeAndre's favorite topic. "He's going to talk about bridges for the rest of the day," Deja informed Margaret. "You know that, right?" "Probably," Margaret agreed. "Boys," Deja sighed with theatrical exasperation. "They're boring sometimes." Margaret looked at her daughter. then at her son, sitting in the grass with his father, gesturing at his notebook, while Mark listened with his entire body. Then at Mark himself, who was sitting on the ground in a public park, looking like the happiest man in South Carolina, all traces of Billionaire CEO gone, replaced by something simpler and more valuable. A father hearing his son. "I know," Margaret said softly. "But it's kind of nice, don't you think?" "I guess," Deja allowed. "Can we go to the swings?" They migrated into the park, DeAndre and Mark walking side by side, still deep in conversation about structural engineering, while Margaret and Deja headed for the playground. Deja attacked the swings with her typical intensity, pumping her legs with focused determination, singing a song about a dragon who could fly higher than airplanes. "Push me," she demanded of Margaret. Higher. Margaret pushed. She watched her daughter fly, and she kept one eye on the bench where Mark and DeAndre had settled, their heads bent over the notebook, Mark's pencil adding structural details to DeAndre's bridge drawing. While DeAndre asked questions with the rapid-fire intensity of a child who has found a subject matter expert and intends to drain them of every drop of knowledge they possess. An hour passed. Then 2. Margaret had set no time limit for this visit, an omission she was now second-guessing because the twins showed no signs of wanting to leave, and Mark showed no signs of running out of either patience or genuine engagement. He was good with them. Margaret had to admit it. Not in the polished, practiced way of someone who'd read a book about connecting with children. In the awkward, imperfect, real way of someone who was figuring it out as they went. He said the wrong thing twice, once asking DeAndre a question about school that was too generic, and once mispronouncing the name of Deja's favorite dragon species in a way that earned him a detailed and passionate correction. But he listened when they talked. He asked follow-up questions that proved he'd been paying attention. He treated their interests with the same respect he'd give a colleague's presentation, which was exactly what children wanted and exactly what most adults failed to provide. At noon, Margaret called a break for lunch. They walked to a sandwich shop near the waterfront, the twins between Margaret and Mark, Deja chattering about dragon taxonomy, while DeAndre examined the structural integrity of every building they passed. "That one has a compromised cornice," DeAndre announced, pointing at a historic building on King Street. "How can you tell?" Mark asked. "The mortar joints above the window are cracking in a stair-step pattern," DeAndre explained. "It means the wall is settling unevenly. The cornice is bearing more weight on the left side than the right. Eventually it'll need to be reinforced or it'll separate from the facade." Mark stared at his son with an expression Margaret recognized from the wedding. Wonder mixed with grief. Wonder at what his child was capable of. Grief at all the moments of capability he'd missed. "You're extraordinary," Mark said quietly. "Both of you. You know that, right?" "We know," Deja confirmed breezily. "Mama tells us every day." "Your mama is very smart," Mark said, and he glanced at Margaret with something in his eyes that she wasn't ready to examine too closely. They ate sandwiches at a table by the window. The twins debated whether bridges or dragons were more important to human civilization, a debate that had no possible resolution but generated significant passion on both sides. Mark listened to both arguments with genuine interest and diplomatically declined to declare a winner. "Can I ask you something?" DeAndre said abruptly, putting down his sandwich with the gravity of someone about to change the subject to something that mattered. "Of course," Mark replied. "Why weren't you kind to Mama?" The table went quiet. Deja stopped mid-bite. Margaret's hand froze around her water glass. Mark's face went through something Margaret could only describe as the visible experience of deserving a question and dreading it simultaneously. "She told you about that," Mark said carefully. "She told us you were dishonest," DeAndre said. "That you did things that broke her trust. She said she left because staying wasn't safe for her heart. I want to know what you did." Margaret started to intervene, to redirect, to protect her children from details they weren't ready for, and to protect Mark from the devastating precision of a 5-year-old's interrogation. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the look on DeAndre's face, the same focused, structural assessment he applied to buildings. Maybe it was the understanding that her son needed to evaluate this man's foundation before deciding whether to trust the structure. She looked at Mark. He looked at her, asking permission with his eyes. She gave the slightest nod. Mark took a breath. "Okay," he said. "You deserve a real answer, so I'm going to give you one. But some of it is complicated, and I might have to explain things in a way that doesn't include every detail because some details are for adults to understand." DeAndre nodded. "That's acceptable. I lied about your mom," Mark said. "To other people. I told them things about her that weren't true, things that made her look bad and made me look like a victim. I did it because I was scared of telling the truth about myself, so I made up a story about her instead. That's called dishonesty, and it's one of the worst things you can do to someone you're supposed to love. What did you lie about? Deja asked, her sandwich completely forgotten. I told people that your mom couldn't do something that she actually could do. I took something private between us and turned it into a public story that was false. And when she found out, she was hurt. Really, deeply hurt. In a way that I caused and that I can't undo. Did you say sorry? Deja asked. Not then, Mark admitted. That's part of what made it so bad. I didn't apologize. I didn't try to fix it. I just let the lie keep going because correcting it would have meant admitting I was wrong, and I was too afraid to do that. Are you afraid now? DeAndre asked. Yes, Mark said. I'm afraid right now, sitting at this table, talking to you, because you're asking me to be honest, and honesty is a thing I was worst at for a very long time. DeAndre studied him, that long structural assessment that took in every detail and measured it against some internal standard of integrity that a 5-year-old probably shouldn't possess, but this 5-year-old absolutely did. You should practice, DeAndre said finally, being honest, like how I practiced drawing. I wasn't good at first. My lines were shaky and my proportions were wrong, but I kept doing it every day and I got better. Maybe honesty works the same way. Mark's eyes glistened. He blinked rapidly. Maybe it does, he said, his voice thick. Thank you for that. You're welcome, DeAndre said, and returned to his sandwich with the air of someone who had concluded a satisfactory interview. Margaret stared at her son, then at Mark, then at the space between them, which seemed smaller than it had 2 hours ago. Not closed, but smaller. After lunch, they walked along the waterfront. The twins ran ahead, Deja chasing seagulls with Queenie held aloft like a battle standard, while DeAndre examined the harbor infrastructure with professional interest. Margaret and Mark walked behind them, close enough to supervise but far enough from the children to speak freely. They're incredible, Mark said for the 3rd time that day. But this time, the wonder in his voice was layered with something else, something that sounded like accountability. I can't believe what you've done. Raising them alone, building your business, creating a life where they're this happy and this smart and this confident. You did all of that without me. I did, Margaret confirmed, not as a weapon, as a fact. I want to be part of it, Mark said, not to take credit, not to insert myself into something you've already built, but to add to it, to be a presence that makes their lives bigger, not smaller. Can you give me a chance to do that? Margaret watched Deja trip over a seagull and laugh so hard she fell down. Watched DeAndre offer his sister a hand up without being asked. Watched the easy, instinctive partnership between her children, 2 halves of a sentence that only made sense together. Here's what I can give you, Margaret said. Weekly video calls, Wednesday evenings at 6. 15 minutes to start, longer if the kids want it. 1 visit per month in Charleston, supervised, in public places of my choosing. If, after 3 months, the twins are comfortable and you've been consistent, we can revisit the arrangement. Anything, Mark said immediately. Whatever you set, I'll do. And Margaret stopped walking, turned to face him, looked directly into the eyes her son had inherited. If you miss a call, if you cancel a visit, if you break a single promise to those children, you are done. I don't care about your reasons. I don't care about emergencies or business crises or anything your lawyers might categorize as extenuating circumstances. You show up or you don't. And if you don't, you're gone. Permanently. No appeals. I understand, Mark said. I won't miss. People say that, Margaret replied. Then life gets in the way, and suddenly the kids who were the priority become the accommodation. I've seen it happen to other single mothers. Their children's fathers show up strong for a month, maybe 2, and then the visits get shorter, and the calls get missed, and the promises get broken, and the children learn that the word father means someone who eventually leaves. I won't be that, Mark said. Prove it. The afternoon wound down. The twins were getting tired, that particular kind of exhaustion that 5-year-olds demonstrate by becoming simultaneously more energetic and less rational. Deja was singing louder. DeAndre was getting frustrated with his pencil for not being sharp enough. Both reliable indicators that bedtime was approaching whether anyone wanted to acknowledge it or not. Mark walked them back to Margaret's car. He crouched down to the twins' level for goodbye. "Thank you for today," he said. "Both of you. This was the best day I've had in a very long time." "Will you come back?" Deja asked, holding Queenie against her chest. "If your mom says it's okay, I'll be back next month." "Mama," Deja turned to Margaret. "Is it okay?" Margaret looked at her daughter, at the hope in her face, at the cautious, calculating expression on DeAndre's face beside her, at Mark, crouching on the pavement of a Charleston parking lot, looking up at her like a man asking for water in a desert. "It's okay," Margaret said. Deja hugged Mark, just threw her arms around his neck without hesitation or ceremony, the way 5-year-olds do when they've decided someone is safe. Mark's arms came around her carefully, tentatively, like he was holding something made of glass and light and everything he'd ever lost. DeAndre did not hug. He extended his hand for a handshake, because DeAndre was DeAndre. Mark shook it with appropriate gravity. "Practice being honest," DeAndre reminded him. Every day, Mark promised. After the twins were buckled in, Margaret faced Mark one final time. "You did well today," she said. It was possibly the most generous statement she'd ever made to him. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank them. They're the ones who decided to give you a chance. I'm just honoring their decision." Mark nodded. He stood in the parking lot and watched them drive away. And in her rearview mirror, Margaret saw him standing there until she turned the corner and lost sight of him. "Mama?" Deja's voice from the back seat. "Yes, baby. I think he might be nice. Not all the way nice yet, but working on it." "That's a good assessment," Margaret said. DeAndre said nothing for several minutes. Then, quietly, so quietly, Margaret almost missed it, he said, "His foundation seems stable. I'll need more data to confirm." Margaret drove home. She carried the twins through baths and dinner and bedtime stories. She stood in their doorway and watched them sleep. And then she went to her studio. She sat at her wheel. She centered the clay, and she began to build. Not a vessel this time. Something different. Something she'd never made before. A bridge, 2 sides reaching toward each other, the span between them still empty, but the foundation solid. The engineering sound, the structure designed not for appearance, but for strength. She worked until midnight, and when she finally stepped back and looked at what her hands had made, she saw something that looked like possibility. Imperfect, incomplete, but real. She fired it the next morning. When it came out of the kiln, intact, she set it on the shelf next to the piece called Beginning and stepped back to look at them together. 2 pieces, 2 stages, a vessel repaired with gold, and a bridge not yet finished. She didn't name the bridge, not yet. Some things needed to be lived before they could be named. Some stories needed to be walked through before they could be told. And some endings needed to prove themselves before they could be trusted. But standing in her studio that morning, with clay under her fingernails and Charleston light coming through the windows and the sound of her children waking up in the next room, Margaret felt something she'd been afraid to feel for 5 years. Not happiness. Not yet. Happiness was a verdict, and the evidence was still being collected. Hope. Careful, conditional, guarded hope. The kind that knows exactly how much it has to lose and chooses to exist anyway. She washed her hands. She made coffee. She woke the twins. And she began another ordinary day in the extraordinary life she'd built from nothing. The story wasn't over. Real stories never are. They continue and evolve and face new challenges, and sometimes fall apart and sometimes come together in ways nobody predicted. But Margaret had learned something in the 5 years since she'd stood on a terrace and heard her husband lie about her body. She'd learned that the strongest structures aren't the ones that never break. They're the ones that break and choose to be rebuilt. They're the ones with cracks sealed in gold. They're the ones designed not for perfection, but for endurance. And endurance, Margaret had discovered, was just another word for love. This story was written for every person who has ever been lied about, for every person who has ever rebuilt from wreckage, for every mother who has ever stood in a doorway watching her children sleep and known with absolute certainty that she would burn the world down to keep them safe. You are not what they said about you. You are not the story they told. You are not the verdict they delivered on your body, your worth, your capacity to create and sustain life. You are the vessel, and the fire, and the gold in the cracks. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, I need you to do 3 things. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who is in the middle of their own story of survival, and needs to know that the kiln doesn't have to be the end. And subscribe to Mr. Dawson's Stories, because we tell stories here. Real ones, messy ones, the kind that leave marks and teach lessons and remind us that the hardest parts of being human are also the most beautiful. Drop a comment telling me this. What would you name the bridge? I'll see you in the next story, and until then, keep building.